Yo, what's up everyone? It's Super Harry, and today we're checking out, what if Veela Matriarch found 500 stolen magic cores in Harry at age 1 and hunted every betrayer. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The Fire That Finds the Owl arrived at 3 in the morning. Apollon Delacour was already awake. She had been awake since midnight, when something deep in her chest, something that had no name in French or English, something that existed only in the oldest Veela dialects, the ones passed down through bloodlines rather than books, had clenched like a fist around her heart and refused to let go. She stood at the window of her estate outside Lyon, watching the dark tree lean, her wine untouched on the sill beside her. Her husband, Jean-Pierre, was asleep upstairs. Little Fleur, 4 years old, was curled in her bed with her silver blonde hair fanned across the pillow. The estate was quiet in the way that large old houses get quiet at night, not empty, just holding its breath. The owl hit the glass hard enough to crack it. Apollon caught it before it could fall, her hand moving faster than any humans should. The parchment tied to its leg was ministry issued, French ministry, not British, and marked urgent in red wax. She broke the seal and read it in the dark, not needing a light. Something has happened in Britain. A magical event of catastrophic proportion, centered in a village called Godric's Hollow. He who must not be named is reported dead. Details unclear. All senior practitioners advised to remain in country pending. She stopped reading. The thing in her chest clenched harder. Apollon set the letter down on the sill next to the wine, went upstairs, dressed in 4 minutes, and opérat to Britain without leaving a note. She felt it from half a mile away. Even operating blind into the English countryside, she'd oriented to a ley line she knew ran through Somerset, close enough, even standing in a dark farmer's field with mud pulling at her boots and the November air trying to cut through her coat, she could feel it. A wrongness. Not dark magic exactly, though there was plenty of that residue hanging in the night air like smoke after a fire. Something stranger. Something that made her Veela nature recoil and lean forward at the same time, the way you might react to a sound you couldn't identify, the instinct to run and the instinct to investigate arriving simultaneously. She followed it north, operating in short hops, reorienting each time to the pull in her sternum. Godric's Hollow materialized around her in pieces, a church spire, a lane, the smell of old stone and something charred. The village was dark. Whatever had happened here had happened hours ago, and the British ministry's protective wards, thrown up hastily, she could feel their amateur edges, had kept most of the muggles inside their houses. The few locals who'd ventured out had been obliviated and sent home. She walked through the empty lane without hurrying. The house at the end was rubble. Not the graceful decay of abandonment, rubble. The upper story had collapsed inward. The walls were blackened. Magic had detonated here, the real kind, the kind that doesn't just destroy a building but unravels the space around it, and she could still feel the aftershocks rippling outward in slow, dying waves. She stepped over the fallen gate and picked her way across the debris, her boots crunching on broken stone and singed wood, and the pull in her chest became almost unbearable. She found him under a fallen beam. Not crushed, the beam had formed a kind of arch above him, held by a piece of collapsed ceiling on one side. He was sitting in a small clear space, roughly 18 inches across, surrounded by ruin. 1 year old, maybe slightly more. Silver-green eyes, blinking at her with the slow serious attention of a child who hasn't yet learned that some things are worth crying about. Dark hair. A cut on his forehead that had already stopped bleeding, shaped like nothing she'd ever seen, a jagged bolt, clean-edged, as though it had been drawn with intention rather than made by impact. He looked up at her and said, with great solemnity, "Oh." Apollon Delacour, Veela Matriarch, senior practitioner of the old Veela bloodline magics, a woman who had stared down a fully transformed Veela elder during the territorial disputes of 1974 without blinking, felt her breath leave her body entirely. She crouched down. "Hello," she said, in English, because it seemed like the right language for this specific boy in this specific pile of rubble. He reached up and grabbed her finger. She let him. And that was when she felt it properly, now that she was touching him, now that the Veela bloodline magic in her could reach through her skin and actually read what was in front of her. She had a gift for this. All Veela matriarchs developed it, eventually, the ability to sense the shape of another person's magic, to read what was present and what was absent and what was wrong. She used it to assess threats, mostly. To know before a confrontation who she was dealing with. She used it now on a 1-year-old boy in a pile of rubble. What she felt stopped her heart. Not literally. But close enough to matter. His core, the central column of innate magic that every witch and wizard is born with, the irreducible fundamental thing that makes a magical person magical, was not the small, growing, perfectly formed seed it should have been in a child this age. It was enormous. It was enormous in a way that should have been physically impossible, packed and layered and dense with other magics, foreign magics, dozens and dozens and dozens of distinct magical signatures all compressed into the space of one child's core, and above all of that, woven through all of that, was the black thread residue of the darkest magic she had ever encountered, the kind that leaves a mark on the world like a scar on skin, permanent and irrefutable. She counted. She had to count 3 times because she didn't believe the number the first 2 times. 500. 500 foreign magical cores, each one distinct, each one with its own signature, its own flavor, its own fingerprint. Human magical cores, all of them. Some of them long dead, she could feel the difference, the way old magic goes cool and crystalline over time, and some recent, brutally recent, still warm with the memory of living people. Apollon sat down in the rubble. The boy, Harry, watched her with those green eyes and then very carefully placed her finger in his mouth and chewed on it thoughtfully. She let him do that too, because she needed a moment, and apparently he needed to chew on something, and neither of them was in a position to be particularly fussy about it. 500 stolen magic cores. Stripped from their owners, some of them ripped out in death, some of them surgically removed while the owners were still alive, which was a thing she had heard of exactly once, in a text so old it was written on treated hide rather than parchment, in a chapter that described the practice as being the most grievous violation of magical personhood known to exist. Each core was a person's fundamental magical identity. Removing one didn't always kill, the accounts disagreed, but it destroyed the person's connection to magic entirely and left a wound in their soul that never closed. 500 of them. In this baby. Not scattered, organized. Layered into him deliberately, with precision, with intent. She could read the method when she looked carefully enough. Someone had been collecting them. Someone had been storing them, somehow, possibly inside themselves, possibly in an external vessel, and then, what? Tried to use them all at once. As what? A weapon. The residue of whatever had detonated here suggested something massive had been attempted, something that had gone catastrophically wrong, and in the chaos of that failure the compressed collection of 500 stolen cores had been blasted into the nearest available magical vessel, a 1-year-old boy, whose own core had expanded under the sheer force of the impact to contain them. He hadn't died. Which meant either he was extraordinarily, improbably resistant, or the magic of 500 compressed cores had simply chosen to protect the vessel it now inhabited, the way any concentrated magical force seeks equilibrium and stability. She thought it might be both. "Who are you?" she said softly, not to the boy. She knew who he was, she had read the British magical news, she had heard of James and Lily Potter, had attended a conference where James Potter presented a paper on ancient Fidelius variants, a lifetime ago, but to the question itself. To the weight of it. The boy took her finger out of his mouth and said, with absolute seriousness, "Hoy." "Harry," she agreed. She picked him up. He came without protest, settling against her shoulder with the boneless confidence of a child accustomed to being held, and the contact sent another wave of information through her Veela senses. This time, above and beyond the horror of what had been done to him, she felt him. The actual boy underneath all of it. A core that had been small and perfect and was now vast and overwhelming, but which remained, fundamentally, his. It hadn't consumed him. He hadn't been subsumed. He was still entirely himself, sitting in the center of 500 stolen flames like a child sitting in the middle of a bonfire, completely unburned. She should have left him there. She understood that. The British ministry would be here by morning. Dumbledore, and she knew Dumbledore, knew his reputation, had sat across from him at the International Confederation of Wizards twice and found him precisely as clever and precisely as infuriating as advertised. Dumbledore would have plans for this child. The wizarding world would have opinions about this child. The proper, legal, institutional response was to leave him in the rubble and file a report. She thought about the 500 stolen cores. She thought about the families. She thought about the one still warm enough to have been recently taken, which meant within the last decade, possibly the last 5 years, which meant there were people alive somewhere who had lost their magic, and worse, their fundamental magical self, and had never received so much as an acknowledgement that it had happened to them. She thought about who had done this. She thought about who had allowed this to be done. She left the rubble and walked into the dark lane with Harry Potter on her hip. She was at the end of the village, on the outskirts, preparing to apparate, when she heard the motorcycle. It came down from the sky rather than along the road, which was unusual, and landed in the lane with a sound like controlled thunder. The man who got off it was enormous, tall and broad in that specific way that looked less like size and more like weather, like something you didn't so much encounter as get caught in. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that had been crying for hours and gone hollow somewhere around the third hour, the way faces do when the grief exceeds the body's capacity to express it. He saw her immediately. His hand went to his wand. She tilted her head. "Don't." Something in her voice, or possibly the faint silver-gold shimmer that the Veela in her cast without permission when she was in a state of high emotion, made him hesitate. He looked at the bundle on her hip. His face did something complicated and painful. He started. "Yes," she said. "Who are you?" "Someone who found him first." She shifted Harry slightly. The boy had fallen asleep with the immediacy of the very young, one fist clutching the collar of her coat. "You're the godfather." Sirius Black. He blinked. The grief and suspicion on his face were fighting for space. "How do you know that?" "James mentioned you. At the Fidelius conference in 80. You sat in the back and heckled the speaker." Something moved in Sirius Black's face, a flash of recognition, of warmth, gone as fast as it came, crushed under everything else the night had put on him. "Give him to me," he said. "He's my godson." "I have the right, you have the right," Apollon agreed. "But not tonight. Tonight, there are things happening that you don't yet understand, and people coming who will take this child and place him somewhere based on politics and strategy, and not one of them has felt what I have felt." "What have you felt?" She looked at him steadily. "Come back to me when you're not standing in the wreckage of your best friend's house at 3 in the morning with revenge in your eyes and no plan. Come back to me when you can hear clearly. I will tell you everything then." He stared at her. "I can't just, you have a name to go after," she said. It was a guess, but an educated one. She had read the shape of the grief on him precisely enough to know it wasn't just loss, it was specifically the kind of loss that comes with a target. Someone to blame. Someone he knew. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight. Think first. Tonight, I will keep him safe." Sirius Black opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Who are you?" "Apollon Delacour. You can find me through the French ministry if you need to. But you should know," she paused, "because this next part mattered, I am going to find out everything. About how this happened, and who helped it happen, and who looked away when they should have been looking. All of it. Every name." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Harry, asleep on her shoulder, entirely unbothered by the wreckage of the night around him. "He's all right," Sirius said, and it came out rough, scraped clean of everything except the bare need to know. "He is exceptional," Apollon said, and meant it in ways she couldn't explain in a dark lane at 3 in the morning. He is going to be extraordinary. Sirius nodded. The kind of nod that means I'm allowing this for now and will absolutely come back to it. He looked at his motorcycle. He looked back at her. The revenge was still there in his face, hot and immediate. She watched him decide to go after it anyway, watched the grief override everything else, and felt the particular sorrow of knowing that she couldn't stop him and that it was going to cost him something enormous. Take care of him, Sirius said. I intend to. He got back on the motorcycle. Gunned the engine. Rose into the dark. She watched him go. Then she adjusted Harry against her shoulder, walked to the edge of the village where the protective wards thinned enough to apparate through, and went home to France. Jean-Pierre woke up when she came through the door. He had a gift for that, sensing when she entered a space, even from sleep, which had charmed her when they were young and now, on a night like this, felt like an enormous comfort. She heard him on the stairs as she was settling Harry onto the couch, tucking her coat around him in lieu of a blanket. He appeared in the doorway in his dressing gown, hair disordered, glasses missing. He looked at her, then at the couch. That, he said, is a baby. Yes. Our baby is upstairs. Yes. This is a different baby. Extremely observant of you, Jean-Pierre. He came fully into the room and crouched beside the couch, studying Harry with the careful attention of a man whose wife had just returned from Britain in the middle of the night carrying an infant and who had, over 11 years of marriage, learned that the appropriate response to Apollon in a state of high-focused calm was to ask good questions rather than reflexive ones. Is he hurt? Not in any way I can fix tonight. Magical? Extraordinarily. Jean-Pierre looked up at her. He read her face the way he always did, slowly, thoroughly, not missing anything. Apollon. What happened? She sat down in the armchair across from the couch. The clock on the mantel said 4:30. In a few hours, the wizarding world would wake up to the news that Voldemort was dead and Harry Potter had survived, and it would explode into celebrations and theories and the particular political chaos that follows the death of a Dark Lord, all of it loud and bright and completely blind to the true shape of what had happened. She had maybe 6 hours before the story calcified into something she would never be able to crack open again. She told Jean-Pierre everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she loved most about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the sleeping boy on their couch. 500, he said. 500. And you can identify them. All of them? Given time and the right resources, yes. Each core has a signature. Some of them I may be able to trace to individuals if those individuals are still living. The older ones will take more work. She looked at Harry. But the recent ones, Jean-Pierre, some of them are still warm. There are people alive right now who lost their cores within the last 5 years and have never been told what was done to them, or how, or why they suddenly couldn't do magic anymore. They were just robbed. And nobody told them. Nobody investigated. Because the Dark Lord's organization had people in the ministry. Had people everywhere. She let that sit for a moment. And those people are still there. They'll call themselves victims of the Imperious curse by morning and the ministry will believe them because it's easier than the alternative. Jean-Pierre's face went very still. You're going to go after them. I am going to find every single person responsible for what is in that child, Apollon said, and her voice was the quiet kind that she reserved for the things she was completely certain about, and I am going to make sure they face what they did. Through whatever means are available to me. And the boy? She looked at Harry again. He had turned onto his side in his sleep, both fists curled under his chin. Completely at peace. The 500 foreign magics in him were quiet now, settled, as though they recognized that the vessel carrying them was at rest and had decided to be respectful about it. He stays, she said. Jean-Pierre nodded. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and came back with a blanket, a proper one, not a coat, which he tucked around Harry with the practiced gentleness of a man who had done it for his own daughter for 4 years. Then he straightened up and looked at his wife. Then we should probably get a second cot, he said. She loved him enormously in that moment. Fleur found Harry the next morning. Apollon was in the study, going through every international contact she had, building the first rough architecture of what would become, over the next 9 years, the most methodical privately conducted magical investigation in European history. She heard Fleur's small feet on the stairs, heard them stop at the sitting room doorway, heard the absolute silence of a 4-year-old confronting a completely unexpected situation. Then, Maman. There is a baby on the couch. Yes, Apollon called. Our baby. New baby. Silence again. Then Fleur's voice, very carefully, as though approaching something that might bolt, baby. Hello. Harry, apparently awake, said something unintelligible. His name is Harry, Apollon called. Aye, Fleur repeated, with the deep seriousness of a 4-year-old taking responsibility for the pronunciation of something important. I am Fleur. I am 4. A pause. You are very small. Harry apparently found this funny. She heard him laugh, a baby's laugh, full and unself-conscious, and then Fleur's laugh, startled into existence by it, and then the sound of Fleur sitting on the floor near the couch to be closer to this small, laughing person who had appeared in her sitting room overnight. Apollon kept writing. Albus Dumbledore arrived at 10:30. She had been expecting him, not this fast, but she'd known he would come eventually, had known that someone at the scene would have noticed the signs of her having been there. Veela's presence leaves traces that are distinct from human magical signatures. She had the door open before he knocked. He was exactly as she remembered, tall, silver-bearded, with those half-moon glasses and the particular expression of a man who was accustomed to knowing more than everyone else in the room and was currently recalibrating, because the room had changed. Madame Delacour, he said pleasantly. Professor Dumbledore. Come in. He came in. His eyes went immediately to the sitting room, where Fleur and Harry were now engaged in some complex game involving couch cushions and a stuffed dragon that belonged to Fleur. Harry was standing, unsteadily, but standing, and laughing every time Fleur made the dragon roar. Dumbledore's expression did something very interesting. He appears well, he said. He is, Apollon said. Tea. Please. She made tea and brought it to the study and sat across from him and waited. He had the advantage of greater information about the political situation. She had the advantage of having been at Godric's Hollow first, and he knew it, and they both knew that she knew it. The tea was excellent, she had bought it in Paris last spring and had been saving it, and they both drank it in a moment of entirely civilized silence before he put his cup down and looked at her directly. You felt something, he said. At the house. Yes. I would like to know what. I'm certain you would. He smiled. It was a real smile, not performed, not political, the kind that acknowledged that someone had just done something he found genuinely amusing. Madame Delacour. We are not adversaries. No, she agreed. We simply have different priorities where that child is concerned. And your priority is? His safety. His well-being. And the truth about what was done to him and by whom. Something shifted in Dumbledore's face. It was small, she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching specifically, but it was there. A flinch. Not guilt exactly, but the near neighbor of guilt, the expression of a man confronted with a thing he knows about and has not yet decided how to address. She filed that away. There are prophecies involved, he began. I don't care about prophecies, she said pleasantly. I care about 500 stolen magic cores. The room went very still. Dumbledore set his teacup down with great precision. You counted. 3 times. To be certain. He was silent for a long moment. Looking at his hands. When he looked up, his face had gone through something complicated and landed on an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something honest, something a little tired, something almost like relief. How much do you know? Enough to have spent the last 6 hours writing letters, Apollon said. The question is how much you know and how long you've known it. He met her eyes. Some of it. For some years. He paused. Not the full scope. Not 500. I knew there had been, collection. I didn't know the scale. And you didn't investigate because investigating would have been politically catastrophic. It would have caused a panic, it would have caused justice, she said, and her voice stayed even with considerable effort. Those are not the same thing. I understand why you confused them. I am not going to pretend it was simple. But I will tell you clearly, Albus, I have begun an investigation that I will not stop, and I will not be managed, and I will not be redirected by talk of the greater good or the fragile stability of wizarding society or any of the other very sensible reasons why the truth should wait for a more convenient moment. He looked at her for a long time. He can't go back to Britain, she said. Not yet. Not until I understand the full picture. And not to wherever you were planning to put him. His mother's sister, no. She said it flatly, and something in her tone communicated that this was not the opening of a negotiation. I have read what protections you intend to place on him, I understand the theory of blood magic you're working from, and I am telling you that placing a child who carries 500 foreign magical cores into a location sealed by love-tied blood protections tied to a non-magical person is a catastrophic idea. The resonance alone could, she stopped. Recalibrate it. He cannot go there. He stays here. That is not a request. Dumbledore was quiet. You may visit, she added. I am not unreasonable. He picked up his teacup. Drank from it. Put it down. And then did something she had not fully expected, he nodded. There will be conditions, he said. There are always conditions. She picked up her own tea. What are yours? When he is old enough for Hogwarts, he will attend if he chooses to. He will need guidance about what he carries. There are aspects of the Dark Lord's magic woven through those cores that will need to be, I am aware, she said. I have already contacted the foremost Veela bloodline magic specialist in Europe. She arrives on Thursday. He blinked. Just once. You've been busy. I found a baby in rubble at 3 in the morning, Apollon said. I don't believe in wasting time. He almost smiled again. Set down his cup. Stood. I will need to see him. She led him to the sitting room doorway. Harry and Fleur were now both on the couch, Fleur reading aloud from a picture book in French. She was an early reader, proud of it, while Harry sat beside her and turned pages with his small, careful hands, watching the pictures with that same green-eyed seriousness he'd had in the rubble the night before. He had somehow acquired a piece of Fleur's toast and was eating it with the focused attention he apparently brought to all endeavors. Dumbledore stood in the doorway and watched them, and his face did the complicated thing again, and this time she could read it more clearly. It was the face of a man who had spent years treating a child as a piece in a larger game, confronted with evidence that the piece was a person who had found his own place to sit and was perfectly comfortable there. Harry looked up. He looked at Dumbledore with those impossible green eyes, Lily Potter's eyes. She'd seen photographs, and then he looked at Apollon, and then he looked back at Dumbledore. No, Harry said clearly, and went back to the toast. Fleur giggled, didn't look up from her book. He says that to people he doesn't know, she explained to Dumbledore, with 4-year-old magnanimity. It doesn't mean anything. Dumbledore looked at Apollon. She shrugged. He's very decisive for his age. Dumbledore left an hour later. She walked him to the gate. At the gate, he paused, and turned, and said, in a voice that had dropped all the performance out of it and was just a man talking, he should know what he carries. Eventually. Not yet, but, he deserves to know. Yes, Apollon said. He does. And he will. I will tell him myself when he's ready, and I will tell him everything, not just the parts that are comfortable. Dumbledore looked at her. What are you going to do? With the investigation. She met his eyes. What needs to be done? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, turned, and disapparated. She stood at the gate for a minute, looking at the empty lane. Then she went back inside, sat down at her desk, picked up her quill, and continued writing names. She had a list to build, and she had barely started. 3 weeks later, Apollon had her first confirmation. The Veela bloodline specialist, a woman named Margit Vasarli, Hungarian, 70 years old and with the demeanor of someone who had outlived all her patience for nonsense, spent 4 days with Harry before she gave Apollon her assessment. They sat at the kitchen table while Harry slept upstairs, Fleur asleep in the room beside him, Jean-Pierre respectfully absent in his workshop. The cores are stable, Margit said. Compressed but not volatile. The boy's own magic has integrated around them. Like scar tissue, in a way, but healthier. He won't rupture. But they're still distinct. Still identifiable. Still distinct, yes. Each one separate. He has 500 distinct magical signatures living inside his own core, and his own core is growing around them, incorporating them as insulation rather than as fuel. It is the most remarkable magical morphology I have ever seen in a living person. She drank her tea. He didn't choose this. No. But his magic chose how to handle it. That choice, that's his. That's entirely his. Margit looked at her. What you're asking me next is whether it affects him. Does it? It will enhance his raw magical capacity to a degree I can't fully calculate. Not because he can access those 500 cores, he can't, they are not his to use, but because having that volume of magical density in his core will create a kind of pressure that his own magic responds to, amplifies against. Think of, you know how muscles develop under resistance. Apollon nodded. Like that. His magic will grow extraordinarily strong simply by virtue of existing alongside that much other magical density. She paused. He will also, I suspect, have an unusual degree of magical intuition. Empathic resonance. Possibly accidental readings of other people's magical signatures. The 500 will bleed information sometimes, not their memories, nothing so precise, but impressions. Old learning. He will find things easy that other children find difficult, and he will not always know why. Apollon looked at the ceiling, at the floor above it, where Harry was sleeping. And the dark magic woven through them? That is the complicated part. Margit set her teacup down. The dark residue, it's a soul anchor. A piece of whoever cast it, embedded in the collection like a nail through a stack of papers. It is the thing that was meant to keep the Dark Lord tethered. It failed, mostly. Mostly is not entirely. She looked at Apollon directly. There is a fragment. Small. Not dominant, not controlling. But present. It will need to be addressed eventually, or when the boy is older and the Dark Lord, because this magic is structured specifically for return. Apollon, do not let anyone tell you he is fully gone. When he finds a way back, that fragment will be a vulnerability. Can it be removed? Carefully. With time. Not yet, he is too young, his core is too fluid. In a few years, perhaps. If someone with the precise bloodline magic to do it is available. She raised an eyebrow. Apollon held her gaze. I've been practicing. I know. I trained your grandmother. I know exactly what you can do. Margit stood, straightening her coat. Keep him calm. Keep him loved. Keep his magic in an environment that is warm and stable. What is feeding his development right now is not the 500 cores, it is the relationship with your family. The security of that is more important than anything I could do from the technical side. She paused at the kitchen door. Those families. The ones the cores were taken from. I'm building the list, Apollon said. When you have names, I can help verify signatures. I have worked with enough families over the years, some of them will have come to me after losing their magic. I may recognize some of the cores. Apollon felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. How many do you think you'll recognize? Margit's face was absolutely still. More than is comfortable, she said. That much I can already tell you. More than is comfortable. She left. Apollon sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then she heard small feet on the stairs, and Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas. Jean-Pierre had gone shopping the morning after his arrival and returned with a baffling quantity of tiny clothing, with his hair going in 6 directions and his green eyes serious and sleepy. He looked at her. She looked at him. Hungry, she said. He nodded. She stood and began making breakfast, and he climbed onto his chair at the table, their table, already, without ceremony, without anyone making a decision about it, it had simply become true, and watched her move around the kitchen with those eyes that saw everything and already, in 3 weeks, had learned to find her presence the kind of comfortable that lives in the body rather than the mind. She made eggs. She made toast. She cut his into small pieces without being asked because she'd learned he liked it that way. She made coffee for herself, strong and dark, and sat across from him and drank it while he ate. Outside the kitchen window, the November garden was bare and frost-touched, the sky the specific grey of a French morning in late autumn. Somewhere in Britain, Sirius Black was in Azkaban, she had found out 2 days ago, had felt a cold fury about it that she had added to the list along with everything else. Somewhere in Britain, the wizarding world was celebrating and not asking the right questions, and the people who should have been held accountable were constructing their cover stories. Somewhere in the world, there were 500 families. She had 53 names so far. The list was growing. Harry ate his eggs and looked at her and said, with no particular context, "Good." "Yes," Apollon said. "It is." She picked up her quill from the counter where she'd left it and continued writing. Chapter 2, The Weight of Names. 9 years had a way of changing the shape of things. The Delacour estate had grown into itself differently since that November night, not larger, exactly, but denser, layered with the particular energy of a house that had been asked to contain more than it was originally built for. The study had become something between a library and a war room. The kitchen had a permanent second breakfast setting that nobody had consciously decided to make permanent. The garden had a scorched patch near the south wall where Harry and Fleur had once attempted to test the limits of what happened when you asked 500 compressed magical cores to do something, and had discovered, empirically and at some cost to the rose bushes, that the answer was more than expected. The roses had grown back faster than they should have. They were now enormous. Nobody mentioned it. Harry was 10 years old and sitting in the highest branch of the old oak at the east end of the garden, reading. He read the way he did everything, completely, with the focused absorption of someone for whom partial attention was a foreign concept. The book was a French magical history text, thick enough to use as a weapon, and he'd been in the tree for 3 hours. Below him, the estate went about its morning business. He could hear Apollon in the study, the scratch of her quill, which he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He could hear Fleur in the kitchen arguing with the wireless about something, which was a thing she did that made no logical sense and that he found deeply endearing. He could hear Jean-Pierre in the workshop, the tap and ring of metal on metal, unhurried and rhythmic. He turned a page. The history text was covering the late 1970s. It was being careful about it, the way all wizarding history texts were careful about that period, using words like unrest and difficult times and certain individuals instead of the direct terms, as if naming the thing too plainly gave it power. Harry found this cowardly. He had mentioned this to Apollon once, and she had looked at him with the expression she wore when he said something she agreed with but wanted him to arrive at himself, and said, "What would you write instead?" He'd spent an afternoon on it. The version he produced used every name. He heard the gate open. Not a sound he missed, even 3 branches up and absorbed in a book. The estate's wards hummed differently when the gate opened, a specific low vibration he'd learned to read the same way he'd learned to read the scratch of Apollon's quill. He closed the book, marked the page, and looked down through the leaves. A woman he didn't know was crossing the garden. 40, maybe. Dark coat, practical boots, the specific posture of someone who'd spent years in situations that required being ready to move in any direction. She was French ministry, he could see the badge, but she was moving like the badge was incidental, like she was here for something the badge didn't cover. He dropped out of the tree. He landed quietly, which was easy, he'd been practicing since he was 7, and the magic did what he asked without requiring much negotiation. The woman heard him anyway and turned, and her eyes went to him with a sharpness that told him she'd been briefed on who he was. People who hadn't been briefed always startled when they saw him, the same way they startled when they saw Apollon, because even at 10 he radiated something that wasn't quite right by ordinary standards, a density that people felt before they processed it intellectually. "You're Harry," she said. "Your ministry," he said. "Investigative Division." "Colette Bernard." She didn't offer her hand. Is Madame Delacour available?" "Probably." "What's this about?" She hesitated. He watched her decide whether a 10-year-old deserved a real answer, and watched her arrive at the conclusion, correctly, that this particular 10-year-old was not going to be usefully misled. There was an incident in Bordeaux last Tuesday. A man named Patrice Fournier was found in a state of magical collapse. Total core severance, his magic is gone, completely and permanently. He's 63 years old and had been a practicing wizard for 58 years. She paused. Before the collapse, there were witnesses who reported seeing a woman matching certain descriptions speaking with him in a café. Harry looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll get Apollon," he said. The kitchen had become the place where serious things happened, which was a natural evolution because Apollon believed that serious things should happen somewhere comfortable and that comfort was not a concession to weakness but a strategic advantage. She made coffee for Colette Bernard without asking, set it in front of her, and sat across the table with her own cup and her hands around it, and waited. Harry sat in the corner with his book. Neither of the adults told him to leave. "Patrice Fournier," Apollon said. "You know the name." "I know many names." Colette Bernard looked at her steadily. She was not, Harry decided, a person who was easily intimidated, which made her interesting. Most people who came to the estate from official positions arrived with the particular tension of someone who wasn't certain what they were walking into. Bernard had the look of someone who decided, on the way over, exactly how she wanted to handle this and was committed to it. He respected that. "He was on a list," Apollon said. "Not a question." "He was in the records," Bernard said carefully, "as having participated in the transfer of a magical object of unknown provenance in 1978. An object we believe was used in certain practices. He was not the primary actor. He was peripheral." She paused. "He also has a family. A wife. 3 adult children. Grandchildren." "I know that." "Then you understand." "I understand that he has a family," Apollon said. "I also understand that in 1978, Patrice Fournier facilitated the acquisition of a containment vessel that was used to store 17 stripped magical cores. I know the names of 11 of those 17 people. 4 of them are dead. 7 of them are alive, and for the last 40 years they have not been able to do magic, and not one of them has ever been told why, or by whom, or that anyone knew what had happened to them." She picked up her coffee. "Patrice Fournier was peripheral." "Yes. And peripheral people in a functioning justice system face peripheral consequences. But we are not in a functioning justice system. We are in a system that has spent 40 years looking at the people Fournier facilitated and calling their loss of magic unexplained magical degradation." Bernard was quiet. "How is he?" Apollon asked. "Alive. Stable. Devastated." Bernard looked at her coffee. "He's cooperating with the investigation. He's been cooperative since the moment he woke up, actually. He's given us 4 other names. I know 3 of them already. The 4th is new. The 4th is, potentially useful." Apollon set her cup down. "I don't need to know which one. I am simply establishing that he was forthcoming. Harry turned a page. Bernard looked at him, then back at Apollon. This is the third incident in the last 8 months. Devereux in January. Marchetti in April. Now Fournier. She leaned forward slightly. I am not here to arrest you, Madame Delacour. I am here because the investigative division has a file that is growing in ways that are going to attract attention from people with less nuanced views, and I would rather have a conversation now than a formal inquiry later. That is considerate of you. I'm not being considerate. I'm being practical. Bernard picked up her coffee. I have a cousin who lost her magic when she was 26. 1981, one morning she woke up and it was gone. She spent a decade trying to find out why. Was told it was spontaneous degradation. Has lived as a squib for 29 years. She looked directly at Apollon. Her name isn't on your list. The room was very quiet. Yet, Apollon said. Bernard put her cup down and pulled a folded piece of parchment from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. My information on the Marchetti connection. Things that didn't make it into the official file. She stood. I was never here. Of course not, Apollon said. Bernard looked at Harry on her way to the door. He looked back over the top of his book. Something passed between them, the silent acknowledgement of two people who have both understood the same thing about the same situation, and she left. Apollon unfolded the parchment. Harry got up and came to look over her shoulder. She didn't tell him not to. The war room was what Harry called the study, though only in his head. He had never called it that to Apollon's face. He was not, in fact, certain she would object. She had once referred to it herself, in a dry aside to Jean-Pierre, as my project, with a tone that made project carry about 20 additional meanings, but he had a sense that naming it too directly would be like pointing at something during a card game. You didn't do it. He went in that afternoon, while Apollon was at the French ministry for a meeting she'd been summoned to that she described as tedious and probably illuminating. She had not told him not to go in. She never told him not to go in. She had shown him the room herself, 3 years ago, on his 7th birthday, with the specific gravity of someone making a decision they'd been deliberating for a long time. She had sat him down in the leather chair opposite the main wall and said, I want to show you something. And I want you to understand that I am showing you because you deserve to know, not because I want to burden you with it. You can look and then go back to being 7. That is allowed. He had looked. He had gone back to being 7, mostly. But he had come back, regularly, over the 3 years since, because the room did something to him that he couldn't fully explain, pulled at him in the way that the truth of a thing pulls at you when you're standing close to it, the way you can feel a fire's heat before you're technically near enough for it to burn you. The main wall held 500 names. Not all of them had been there from the beginning. Apollon added them as she confirmed them, each one written in her precise, even hand on a small card, each card pinned to the wall in a grid that had expanded steadily outward over 9 years until it now covered the entire western wall of the study, floor to ceiling. Each card had a name, a date, and a color-coded mark in the corner, green for living, red for dead, black for unknown. Some of the cards had photographs. Some had additional notes in margins so small you needed to lean in close to read them. Below the cards, on the desk, was Apollon's current working document, the investigation in its active form, constantly updated, a living record of who had done what to whom and when and with what degree of intentionality. Harry stood in front of the wall. He did this sometimes. Just stood there. He knew that somewhere inside him, folded into the architecture of his own magic, each of the 500 people on this wall had left their mark. He couldn't access their memories or their experiences. Margaret Basartley had been very clear about that, had explained it in clinical terms that he'd understood intellectually and understood differently in the standing in front of the wall way. But sometimes, standing here, he felt something. Not specific. Not voices or images. More like, warmth in certain directions. Like standing in a room full of people you can't see. One of the green-marked cards near the upper right said Kiva Walsh, Dublin, 1977. Below the name, in Apollin's handwriting, alive, living as Muggle, no knowledge of cause. Contacted indirectly 1987. Not yet ready for full disclosure. Monitoring. He knew most of the notes by now. He reached up and touched the card of a man named Alexander Novak, Polish, 1979, dead, red corner, who had lost his core at 42 and died of unrelated causes at 51, never knowing. Below the name, wife still living. Son, Tomasz, currently a ministry official in Warsaw. O's father truth. Harry had read that particular note maybe 30 times and it still landed differently each time, the specific weight of O's father truth as a notation, the way it contained an entire argument about what honesty is for and who it serves. He was still standing there when Fleur came in. She was 14 now, and she had grown into herself in the specific way that Veela children grew, all at once and then all at once again, like watching something bloom on a time-lapse. She was brilliant, fluent in 4 languages, currently furious with her Beauxbatons professor of advanced charms for what she described as an embarrassing misunderstanding of foundational theory and Harry described as you told him he was wrong in front of the whole class and you're surprised he marked you down. She was also the person he had known longest, in the sense that mattered, the person who had been there from the absolute beginning, who remembered him from before he could walk, who had taught him French by the simple method of refusing to speak English when he was being obtuse and waiting for him to figure it out. She came and stood beside him and looked at the wall. She added 4 more, Fleur said. I saw. He pointed. 3 from the Marchetti connection and 1 from what Bernard brought this morning. Fleur looked at the new cards. Her expression was the one she wore when she was thinking hard but keeping the surface calm, a thing she'd gotten from Apollon, that expression. The Fournier incident is going to be in the Prophet tomorrow. Probably. They'll connect it to Devereux and Marchetti. Probably. She turned to look at him. Are you worried? He considered the question seriously, because Fleur hated when he dismissed things as fine when they weren't. Not about Apollon. She's been building toward this for 9 years and she doesn't make moves she hasn't thought through 14 times. He paused. I'm worried about the ministry closing ranks before she gets enough of the picture public. She has Bernard. She has Bernard until Bernard's career becomes more important than Bernard's cousin. He looked at the wall. But she has more than Bernard. She has Margit. She has the 12 families she's contacted directly. She has all of this. He gestured at the wall, the room, the 9 years of work behind it. The problem isn't whether she can prove it. The problem is whether proof matters to an institution that is structurally incentivized to not believe it. Fleur looked at him sideways. You've been thinking about this for a while. It's a good problem. It keeps me occupied. She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sigh. You are the strangest person I've ever met. You haven't met that many people. I've met enough. He almost smiled. She caught it, she always caught it, and nudged him with her shoulder, the casual physical ease of people who had spent a decade in the same spaces, who had mapped each other's presence so completely that there was no performance in it anymore. Just the comfortable fact of each other. What happened with Dumbledore, she said. He sent another letter. What kind? The kind that uses 4 paragraphs to say 1 sentence. Harry pulled a folded letter from his pocket, he'd been carrying it since it arrived that morning, working out how to feel about it. He handed it to her. She read it standing there. He watched her eyes move across the page and watched her expression go through several things. At the end, she folded it and held it out to him. He wants you to come to Hogwarts early. Before your year begins. To meet him. Yes. He hasn't stopped. He's very persistent for someone who agreed to stay away. Harry took the letter back. He's also not wrong about everything. Margit says the same thing he does about the soul fragment, that it will become a problem before I start school if it's not addressed. Fleur's expression shifted into something sharper. He wants access to you. The meeting is a pretext. Obviously. But the soul fragment isn't a pretext. Harry looked at the letter. I'm going to write back. And say what? That I'll meet him. Here. On my terms. He tucked the letter away. He can have one conversation about the soul fragment. What he does with it tells me a lot about what the other conversations are going to look like. Fleur studied him. You're not afraid of him. It wasn't a question. She knew the answer. But sometimes she said things to confirm them, to put them into the air as established facts rather than assumptions, and he had come to understand this as one of her ways of taking care of people, this quiet act of making certainties more certain. No, he said. But I'm not dismissing him either. He is actually very clever, and he does actually care about stopping what's coming, and both of those things are real regardless of his methods. He paused. The difference between me and everyone who Dumbledore has managed before is that I've been watching him for years through Apollin's notes, and I know what he looks like when he's being careful with the truth. Fleur made the laugh-sigh sound again. And what does he look like? Like someone having a conversation with himself about the best way to say something true. She looked at the wall one more time. The 500 names. The green and red and black corners. She'll be home by dinner, Fleur said. She'll want to hear about Bernard's parchment. I know. And Gabrielle keeps asking when you're coming back downstairs. She's been trying to show you something since this morning. Harry's expression did the thing it only did for Gabrielle, not softer exactly, but differently focused, the way a lens shifts to accommodate a change in distance. Gabrielle was 6 years old and had arrived in the world with what Jean-Pierre called an unsettling capacity for observation and what Harry called being smarter than everyone gives her credit for, and she had decided, from roughly the age of 3, that Harry was the most interesting person in her orbit and had dedicated considerable resources to proving this to him on a rotating basis. He left the war room and went downstairs. Gabrielle was in the sitting room with a piece of parchment and what appeared to be a very thorough diagram of something. She heard him on the stairs and looked up with the focused intensity she brought to everything, silver blonde hair escaping its braid in approximately 9 places. I figured it out, she said. Figured what out? The names. She held up the parchment. She had drawn, in the careful hand of a 6-year-old who had been watching people write seriously all her life and had absorbed their gravity about it, a diagram that connected 7 names from the study's eastern wall with a series of lines and dates. These ones here, they're all from the same 2 years. And these connections, she pointed with enormous seriousness, they all go through one place. Lion. 1976 and 1977. Harry sat down cross-legged on the floor and took the parchment from her. He looked at it. She was right. It wasn't something he'd seen before, not because the data wasn't there, it was, he'd read every card on that wall, but because he'd been looking at individual cards and Gabrielle, with the clear unsentimental eye of someone who hadn't yet learned to feel the weight of each individual story, had looked at the pattern. Gabby, he said carefully. Emicham. How long have you been in the study? She blinked at him. I don't go in the study. Then how did you? I listen, she said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. Everyone talks. You and Fleur talk, Maman writes and sometimes reads the cards out loud to herself when she's thinking. I've been listening for a long time. Harry looked at the parchment. Then at Gabrielle. Don't tell Apollon you've been listening. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I know. But tell her yourself, directly, when she gets home. Don't let her find out sideways. He looked at the parchment again. This is really good, Gabby. This is actually, he stopped. Do you want to come with me? I want to check this against the wall. She stood up immediately, with the complete readiness of someone who has been waiting to be included. Apollon came home at 6 to find Harry and Gabrielle in the study, cross-referencing the diagram against the cards on the wall, both of them on the floor surrounded by notes. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Harry heard her and looked up. Gabrielle did not look up, because she was in the middle of confirming something and had not finished. She drew that herself, Harry said. She's been eavesdropping. I've been listening, Gabrielle said, without looking up. Apollon crossed the room. She looked at the diagram. She crouched down between them and studied it in silence for a long moment. Lion, she said quietly. 1976 and 1977, Harry said. 7 of the confirmed names in that window all connect through the same city. Gabrielle found it. Apollon looked at her youngest daughter. Gabrielle finally looked up, and for a moment they regarded each other with the particular intensity of two people who shared enough that regular communication had a tendency toward compression, entire things communicated in a look. You should have come to me, Apollon said. I wanted to be sure first, Gabrielle said. You always say don't bring half a thought. I say that about theoretical magic work. The principle is the same. Harry pressed his lips together hard and looked at the wall. Apollon was quiet for another moment. Then she took the diagram and stood up. There is a man in Lion, she said. I have had his name in my working document for 2 years. I have been gathering evidence. She looked at the diagram. Gabrielle has just told me I have enough. Harry looked up at her. You're moving. Next week. She set the diagram on the desk. And there is something else. She pulled her own folded parchment from her coat, different from the one Bernard had left, this one sealed with a different mark. The ministry has opened a formal inquiry into the 3 incidents. They are calling it vigilante magical assault. They have issued a request for cooperation. She set it down on top of the diagram. They have also, in the same envelope, included a private note from the minister himself asking for a meeting. What kind of meeting? Fleur asked from the doorway. She'd come down too, sometime in the last hour. The kind where he wants to understand what I'm doing before it becomes something he can't contain. Apollon's tone was entirely level. Which means he already suspects it's something he can't contain. Are you going to meet him? Harry said. Of course. She looked at him. Every conversation with the minister is an opportunity. He wants information. I want his sense of how far the rot goes in the British wing of the inquiry, because the 3 incidents have crossed borders. Marchetti was Italian, Devereux was Belgian, and the British ministry has been conspicuously quiet. She paused. Dumbledore wrote again. I know. I'm writing back tonight. She looked at him with that specific expression, not approval exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a person doing what they were going to do for reasons that are their own to own. What are you going to say? That I'll meet him here. In the study. He met her eyes. I think he should see the wall. The room was quiet for a moment. Apollon's expression shifted through something he caught only the edge of, the way you catch the edge of a much larger thing when it turns. Something that was part pride and part grief and part the very particular emotion of watching a child become the thing you raised them to be and realizing, for the first time with full clarity, that you have succeeded, and that success has a weight to it too. Yes, she said. I think he should. The letter to Dumbledore took him 2 drafts. The first was too long. He had Apollon's tendency to be thorough, and he was still developing judgment about when thoroughness served and when it got in the way. He cut it down. The second draft said, Professor Dumbledore, I am willing to meet. Here, on the 14th, bring whatever you need regarding the fragment. I have things I want you to see. Harry Potter. He sealed it and sent it with the estate's owl, a large, extremely opinionated bird named Voltaire who had been Jean-Pierre's for 15 years and had transferred allegiance to Harry the previous winter with no explanation and some offense to Jean-Pierre. Voltaire accepted the letter with dignity and departed. Harry went to bed. He lay in the dark in the room that had been his room for 9 years, under the window that looked east toward the oak tree, and he did what he sometimes did before sleeping, let his awareness settle inward, past the ordinary noise of a tired body, past the familiar hum of his own magic, and into the deeper register where the 500 lived. They were quiet tonight. They were usually quiet. Sometimes they weren't, sometimes, in moments of high emotion or stress, he felt them stir in that sourceless way, warm pressure moving through the layers of his core like heat through a wall. Not communication. Not presence in any conscious sense. Just, weight. Warmth. The reminder that he carried something that had belonged to other people, and that this fact meant something, and that the something it meant was not a burden in the way people assumed it was a burden. It was, on most nights, something closer to company. He thought about the wall. 500 cards. Green and red and black. He thought about Gabrielle on the floor with her diagram, connecting lines that he'd been too close to see. He thought about Colette Bernard saying she's never been told why, about her cousin in a Muggle life for 29 years because someone stripped her magic and nobody caught them. He thought about the ministry's formal inquiry and the minister's private note and the very interesting gap between the two, the gap that was shaped exactly like we know more than we're saying in the official document. He thought about Dumbledore. The soul fragment. The thing that Margaret and Dumbledore agreed on, in their very different ways, that it was going to become a problem, that it was tied to a return that was coming whether anyone planned for it or not, that the fragment inside him was the Dark Lord's insurance policy against total extinction. He thought about the fact that he was 10 years old and none of this frightened him. He examined this fact, as he occasionally did, with genuine curiosity. It seemed like it should. By any reasonable accounting of the situation, a child aware of what he carried and what it meant and what was coming should be afraid, or at minimum troubled in the specific way that large things trouble people when they become real. But the war room was real, and Apollin's quill was real, and the scorched patch in the garden where the roses now grew enormous was real, and Gabrielle's diagram was real, and Voltaire was currently somewhere in the night carrying a letter to the most important wizard in Britain, and all of it felt not like the approach of something he couldn't handle but like the ongoing fact of a life that was already in motion, already working, already aimed at something worth aiming at. He fell asleep. Outside his window, the oak tree stood in the autumn dark, and the roses at the south wall were 3 feet taller than they should have been, and in the study, the 500 cards caught the moonlight from the window, each one a name, each one a debt, each one a direction for a family that didn't yet know it had somewhere to turn. The list had 231 names now. Apollon was adding more. Chapter 3, The Boy Who Arrived. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. Harry was on the platform at 10:30, which was not because he was anxious but because Apollon had a principle about arriving early to places where other people's first impressions of you would matter, and he had absorbed this principle so completely it had stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like a preference. Platform 9 3/4 was chaos. Not bad chaos, the specific productive chaos of a place full of people who are genuinely excited about the same thing, families pressed together, owls complaining, cats trying to escape wicker carriers, a pair of twins near the barrier doing something with a fanged frisbee that 3 separate adults were trying to stop with diminishing commitment. Steam from the Scarlet engine moved through everything in lazy drifts. The noise was enormous. Harry stood with his trolley and looked at all of it with the calm attention of someone who has been briefed extensively and is now comparing notes. Apollon stood beside him. She had come alone, Jean-Pierre and the girls were at home, Fleur back at Beauxbatons for her 5th year, Gabrielle in the middle of a project about magical plant propagation that she had refused to interrupt for anything short of a genuine emergency. The goodbye that morning had been efficient, Jean-Pierre's hand on his shoulder, Gabrielle's diagram pressed into his hands, in case you need it, for reference, and Fleur, who had pulled him into a hug that lasted slightly longer than her usual efficiency allowed, and said into his hair, "Right. Don't be mysterious about it, just actually write. I know how to write letters, Fleur. You know how to write 3 sentences and call it a letter." He had promised to be more thorough. She had looked unconvinced. Now Apollon scanned the platform with her particular brand of attention, not surveillance exactly, more like the natural behavior of a person whose senses were finely calibrated and who had stopped bothering to suppress the information they collected. "Weasley family, for children going," she said quietly, nodding toward a cluster of red heads near the middle of the platform. "The twins and 2 others. The girl is new. And there. Harry nodded left. A boy with white blonde hair, flanked by two large companions and a man whose posture communicated I owned several things including this conversation, a posture Harry had seen in photographs. Lucius Malfoy. The boy would be Draco. They had a card in the war room. Lucius Malfoy had a card in the war room. The Malfoy card was not green. Apollin's expression didn't change. Don't make enemies on the first day. I'm not planning on making enemies at all. That's different from enemies not making themselves. She looked at him sideways. Dumbledore will be watching how you settle in. I know. Don't make it easy for him to categorize you. I'm not going to do anything to make it difficult either. He looked at her. You're worried. I'm always worried, she said, without particular drama. It's what I do between investigations. She looked back at the platform. The soul fragment has been stable since Margot's work in August. The resonance is down. You are, by every measure, fine. She paused. I am still sending you to school in a country that has spent 10 years telling a story about you without your input. I'm aware of the story. The story has teeth. The story is wrong about most of the important things, Harry said. That's actually useful. It means nobody knows what to expect. She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, the small precise movement that was her version of a full smile. Good, she said. Keep it that way. She walked him to the train. At the door, she put her hand briefly on the side of his face, a gesture she made rarely and always meant, and said, in French, every name on the wall knows where you are. They go with you. He nodded. The train whistle blew. He got on. He found an empty compartment 2 carriages in, stowed his trunk, and settled by the window with a book. He was 3 pages in when the door opened. The boy who looked in was red-haired, freckled, and had an expression of someone who had been walking the length of the train looking for somewhere to sit and had mostly given up on being selective. He looked at Harry, looked at the empty compartment, looked back at Harry. Anyone sitting here? No, Harry said. The boy came in and wrestled an enormous, battered trunk into the overhead rack with the practiced effort of someone doing this with luggage that was slightly too large for the space it was meant to occupy. He dropped into the seat across from Harry and pushed his hair out of his face. Ron Weasley. Harry Potter. Ron Weasley blinked. Then he did the thing Harry had observed people doing since he was old enough to be taken into public, the rapid scan, looking for the scar. Harry's fringe covered most of his forehead. Ron found the edge of it anyway, the bolt shape just visible at the hairline, and his expression went through surprise and recalibration and landed on something that was at least trying to be normal. Right, Ron said. Yeah. He paused. You don't look like I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Different. He seemed to be working something out. You've been in France? Since I was 1. What's that like? Harry considered. Formative, he said, which made Ron look at him with the expression of someone who had been given an answer that technically addressed the question. He took pity on him. Good. It was good. My family is there. Who's your family? The Delacours. Ron's brow furrowed with the effort of someone who had heard that name but couldn't place it. That's a French name. It is. But your parents were Potter and, I know who my parents were, Harry said, without heat. The Delacours raised me. Apollon Delacour found me after Godric's Hollow and took me home. He looked at Ron directly. Is that strange to you? Ron thought about it with a seriousness Harry hadn't expected. Not really, he said finally. My mum would have done the same. Found a baby in rubble, I mean. She'd have just taken it. He shrugged. She's got 6 kids already. What's one more? Harry felt something settle in his chest, a specific ease, the kind that comes from someone being unexpectedly straightforward about something. How many of you are at Hogwarts? 3 after today. For if you count Percy, who's a prefect and mostly doesn't count. Ron pulled a package of sandwiches from somewhere in his robes. Fred and George are the twins. I'm the youngest boy. He opened the package. Cheese and pickle. Mom makes too many. Want one? Harry accepted a sandwich. They ate in companionable quiet for a minute. Outside the window, London gave way to countryside in the fast determined way it did heading north. Harry watched it and Ron watched Harry in the sidelong manner of someone trying to reconcile something. The papers say Dumbledore placed you with your aunt and uncle, Ron said eventually. Carefully. Testing whether this was a thing they were allowed to discuss. The papers are wrong about a lot of things. Does Dumbledore know they're wrong? Harry looked at him. Ron was, it turned out, less guileless than the cheese and pickle approach had suggested. Yes, Harry said. He's known for 10 years. Ron processed this. Right, he said again, in a different tone than before. The compartment door opened again. A girl looked in, brown bushy hair, slightly breathless, the expression of someone in the middle of a task with several subtasks. Have either of you seen a toad? A boy named Neville Longbottom has lost his. Not since we boarded, Harry said. She looked at him. The same scan as Ron, faster, because she was faster, he could already tell, the scar, the face, the calculation. Then something different in her eyes, something that wasn't just recognition. She stepped fully into the compartment and shut the door. You're Harry Potter. Yes. You were raised in France. Yes. By a Veela matriarch. She said it with the tone of someone who has read something and is confirming the source. I read about it. In Notable Missing Persons in Post-War Wizarding Britain, it's a bit of a niche text, you wouldn't, I've read it, Harry said. Chapter 4. The section on disputed guardianship cases is incomplete, but the footnotes on Apollin's formal petition to the British Ministry in 1983 are accurate. The girl stared at him. Hermione Granger, she said, sitting down without asking, which he appreciated. The footnote said Dumbledore co-signed the petition. Did he? He did. Harry tilted his head. You've done more research than most. I research everything. She said it without apology. You're the most significant magical event in recent history. Of course I researched you. She looked at Ron. Ron Weasley. I've read about your family too. Good things. Ron said. Mixed, she said honestly, which made Ron sputter. She looked back at Harry. What are you expecting from Hogwarts? An education, he said. And answers to some questions. What questions? He looked at her. She was direct in a specific way that came from not having learned yet that directness made some people uncomfortable, not social blindness, he didn't think, but a confidence that the information was more important than the performance of not wanting it. He decided, in the way he occasionally decided things quickly, that she was worth being direct back at. There are 43 former Hogwarts students on a list I've been helping build for 9 years, he said. I want to know which ones are still connected to the British magical establishment. Hermione Granger looked at him with complete stillness. What kind of list, she said. The kind you're going to read about in about 3 years, he said. When Apollon publishes. Apollon, your guardian? Yes. She's investigating something. She's been investigating something since the night she found me. He picked up his book. She's almost done. Hermione looked at Ron, who shrugged in a he was like this when I got here kind of way. She looked back at Harry. She had the expression of someone who has encountered a problem that is more interesting than the one they came in with and is deciding whether to reprioritize. I should keep looking for the toad, she said. You should, Harry agreed. Neville Longbottom will be glad to get it back. She stood. At the door she paused. What's the list called? It doesn't have a name, Harry said. Apollon thinks naming it gives it an edge that should belong to the truth instead. He turned a page. I think she's right. Hermione left. He heard her in the corridor a moment later, asking someone about a toad. Ron was looking at him. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Say something like that and then just go back to your book. Harry thought about it. Practice, he said. Ron shook his head, accepted this, and pulled out a battered chess set. The Great Hall hit Harry like a physical thing. Not the magic of it, though there was plenty of that, the enchanted ceiling with the early autumn evening overhead, the candles, the accumulated centuries of magical resonance in the stone, all of it registering clearly in the deep way things registered for him. Not even the noise, which was substantial, hundreds of students and the overlap of many simultaneous conversations. It was the feeling of the 500, shifting. They did this sometimes in places of concentrated old magic, stirred, the way you feel a current in a deep river when you're standing in still water above it. Not distress. Not warning. Just awareness. We are here too. He had learned to let it move through him without reacting, the way you learn to walk on a boat, adjusting without showing adjustment. He walked in with the other first years and felt the hall look at him. All of it. The entire room. He had expected something like this, the name, the story, 10 years of a specific mythology, but the reality of it was still interesting, the wave of attention as distinctive as a change in air pressure. Most of the faces were curious. Some were openly shocked. A few, at the table he identified as Slytherin, went careful and assessing. The Sorting Hat was exactly as Hermione had described it on the train. She had memorized the relevant chapter in Hogwarts, a history, and had shared this information with the general compartment for the last hour of the journey, not from smugness but from a genuine belief that everyone would want to know, which Harry had found endearing. The first years went in alphabetical order. Harry watched the hat work. It was faster with some students than others. Hermione Granger took approximately 30 seconds and was placed in Gryffindor with an expression of absolute vindication. Ron Weasley was placed almost before the hat touched him, which he wore with the specific ease of someone following an established track. Potter, Harry. He walked to the stool. Saturday. The hat came down. The inside of the hat was dark, and then the hat was in his head, and the hat was, surprised. He felt it. Not in a dramatic way, but the way you feel someone stop mid-sentence because they've encountered something they didn't anticipate. A pause. Then, well. That's a great deal of, you're carrying rather a lot, aren't you? Yes, Harry thought at it. 500, yes. And you've known since you were 7. Since before that. But Apollon told me properly at 7. The hat was quiet for a moment. He got the impression of something vast and old taking a very careful reading. He waited. Most children fight me, the hat said. Or try to. Or flinch. You're just, sitting there. You're a magical object doing a magical reading. What exactly would I fight? You'd be surprised. Another pause. You have everything. Genuine courage, real intelligence, extraordinary loyalty, and enough ambition to fuel 6 separate careers. Every house has a claim on you. I'm aware. Where do you want to go? He thought about it honestly. About Ron, who had gotten on a train and shared his sandwiches without ceremony. About Hermione, who had looked at him like a problem she wanted to solve and then come back to help find Neville's toad for an hour anyway. About Apollon, whose own house, she'd mentioned it once, briefly, had been Gryffindor's French equivalent, La Maison du Cœur, which translated loosely as the House of the Brave-Hearted. Where do the people I need to be around end up? Gryffindor, by the look of tonight's group. Then Gryffindor, he thought. But not because I was sorted there. Because I chose it. The hat seemed to appreciate the distinction. Gryffindor, it shouted. The Gryffindor table erupted. He walked to it and sat next to Ron, who handed him another cheese and pickle sandwich from what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply, and across from Hermione, who was already composing what looked like the beginning of a letter. "Writing already?" he said. "My parents will want to know." She paused. "Also, I have questions for them about things we discussed on the train." She looked at him carefully. "Gryffindor. I thought you might be Ravenclaw." "I thought so too, for about 5 seconds." Ron was looking down the table at something, and his expression had gone slightly careful. Harry followed his gaze. 3 seats down, a boy with a round face and a toad cupped in both hands was looking at Harry with an expression that had nothing performative about it, just raw, simple shock, the kind you can't manufacture. Neville Longbottom. The toad, at least, had been recovered. Harry met his eyes. Neville looked away fast. Then, as if overriding himself, looked back. Harry nodded. Neville, after a moment, nodded back. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was watching all of this with an expression Harry recognized, the expression of someone doing rapid recalculation because reality has not matched the brief they were given. Harry had been watching it develop since the sorting, from the moment his name was called and the hall reacted. Whatever Draco had been told about Harry Potter, the version walking around the Great Hall was clearly a different document. Dumbledore stood to address the hall. Harry watched him and was watched in return. He could feel Dumbledore's attention from across the room the same way you feel a specific sound in a crowd, distinct from the general noise. The blue eyes behind the half-moon glasses found him, held for a moment, moved on. The address was warm, slightly theatrical, full of Dumbledore's particular brand of wisdom delivered entertainingly. Harry listened carefully to what was said and, with equal care, to what wasn't. Nothing about the current political climate in Britain, where Fudge's ministry was in the middle of something between a scandal and a restructuring. Nothing about the ongoing investigation that had become impossible to ignore even if the papers were still being careful about naming Apollon directly. Nothing about the fact that 3 people had had their magical cores stripped in the last year by a method that the British ministry had been calling vigilante assault and the French ministry had been calling the logical consequence of 40 years of unprosecuted crime. Just welcome, rules, food. The food appeared and was extraordinary. The house elves of Hogwarts operated with a specificity and abundance that Harry had not encountered even at the Delacour estate, which was itself not modest. Ron's approach to the food confirmed every family stereotype Harry had been gently primed on by Apollon, who had met Molly Weasley twice at ministry functions and described her as extraordinarily capable and perpetually overwhelmed, which explained a lot about why Ron ate like each meal might be his last. Harry ate and watched and built his map of the room. Quirrell was the first thing that felt wrong. He noticed it in the defense against the dark arts classroom on the 3rd day, not the stammer, which was annoying, and not the turban, which was unusual, but something in the magical register that the 500 picked up before he'd consciously processed it. A resonance. Not large. Not direct. More like a harmonic, a note that shouldn't have been in a chord but was there if you listened for it. He didn't say anything to Ron or Hermione about it immediately. He sat in Quirrell's class and paid attention and said nothing, and afterward, standing in the corridor with the other Gryffindors dispersing to lunch, he pulled parchment from his bag and wrote 3 sentences to Apollon. The letter went that afternoon with Voltaire, who had accompanied him to Scotland with the magnificent indifference of an animal who simply expected his preferences to be accommodated. Apollon's response came the next morning, before breakfast. Describe the resonance more precisely. Is it structured, intentional, repeated, or ambient? Your instincts are good. Trust them and watch. He wrote back, structured. It's specific. It responds to certain stimuli, dark magic theory in the lecture, specific names. It gets louder when I'm in the room. Her response came that evening, I know. 2 words, which from Apollon communicated more than a page would have from most people. She knew. She had a card for Quirrell. She was watching him from France, tracking the resonance against something in her files. He filed this and kept watching. Hermione had noticed something was off about Quirrell too, he discovered, when she mentioned it 3 days later in the most Hermione way possible, by presenting him with 2 pages of written observations and a question. His magical signature is inconsistent, she said, laying the pages on the library table between them. I've been measuring it in class. Normal magical signatures have a specific personal frequency. I read about it in Advanced Magical Theory. Dumbledore himself wrote the chapter, and Quirrell's shifts. Not always, but sometimes. Harry looked at her pages. She had drawn a frequency graph, by hand, with data points for each class. It was extremely thorough. What do you think it means? He said. Something is affecting his natural magical signature from an outside source. Or, she paused, and he watched her arrive at the more uncomfortable conclusion, or the person we're dealing with isn't entirely one person. He put his quill down. How long did it take you to get there? About a day. She looked at him. You've known for longer. I felt it on the 3rd day. Why didn't you say anything? I was watching. He looked at her notes. And I needed to know if you'd get there without me pointing you at it, because if you did, it tells me you're going to be useful for what comes next. Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. That's a very strategic way of describing whether someone can be trusted. Efficiency and trust aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a long moment. What is what comes next? He leaned back. There's something in this school that doesn't belong here. Something valuable and probably dangerous, hidden very poorly behind a series of obstacles. He had identified the 3rd-floor corridor on the 2nd day, had felt the magic behind the locked door the way you feel heat through a wall. Whoever is wearing Quirrell is planning to get to it. We need to know what it is before they do. How do we, Hermione? He looked at her steadily. You've been here 11 days and you've already read more about this school than most 7th years. What's currently housed at Hogwarts that would be valuable enough for someone to send an agent after it? She stared at him. Then the gears moved visibly behind her eyes, the rapid cross-referencing of information she had gathered and filed. He could practically see the index cards reshuffling. The Philosopher's Stone, she said. Gringotts vault break-in on July 31st. The vault was empty beforehand. Hagrid, the groundskeeper, collected something from it the same day. Small package. It was in the Prophet. She paused. I thought it was unrelated. Nothing is unrelated, Harry said, which was something Apollon had said to him so many times it had become structural, part of the foundation of how he thought. It's here. And Quirrell is here. He picked up his quill. We're not going to tell Dumbledore yet. She blinked. Why not? Because Dumbledore already knows about Quirrell. He held her gaze. And he hasn't done anything about it. Which means either he's watching and waiting for something specific, or he's using Quirrell as bait for something larger. He paused. Either way, I want to know what it is before I walk into his version of the plan. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. He let her sit with it, because she was doing the honest work of deciding whether this was the right call rather than just agreeing with him. That makes me uncomfortable, she said finally. He's the headmaster. Yes. He's also the most powerful wizard alive. Probably. And you think he's using a situation instead of resolving it? I think he does that, Harry said. Not because he doesn't care. Because he calculates. He looks at a thing and decides what outcome he wants and works toward it, and sometimes the most direct path isn't the path he takes. He paused. He has reasons. Good ones, usually. I just want to know the reason before I become part of the plan rather than after. She looked at him. You sound like you've been thinking about Dumbledore for a long time. 9 years, he said. She was quiet again. Then she squared her pages, tapped them straight, and put them in her bag. All right, she said. What do we do first? He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. We go to the library. I need you to find everything published about the Philosopher's Stone's specific magical properties. I need to know what someone would want it for badly enough to walk into a school to get it. She was already standing up, heading toward the stacks, before he finished the sentence. The letter from Apollon arrived on a Thursday, 4 weeks into term, during breakfast. Voltaire dropped it with the particular drama of an owl who had made a long journey and felt it should be acknowledged. Harry fed him bacon. Ron watched Voltaire with the respect you gave to animals who clearly had opinions. Harry read the letter. He read it twice. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his inside pocket and finished his breakfast and did not say anything about it until the evening, when he and Hermione were in the common room and Ron had gone to bed. She found him, he said. Hermione looked up from her charms essay. Found who? The lion connection. The man at the center of it. He stared at the fire. He facilitated the acquisition of a second containment vessel in 1976. He's the connection point for 41 of the 500 names. He's been living quietly in the south of France for 30 years and he is the single largest peripheral actor in the entire network. He paused. She's meeting with the French ministry tomorrow. She's presenting the full dossier on him. Harry, that's enormous. It's the beginning of enormous, he said. 41 names through one person means 41 families who are about to get answers. It means the French ministry is going to have to respond publicly. It means the British ministry can't stay quiet anymore. He looked at the fire. And it means the people in Britain who have been relying on the French ministry's inaction as cover are going to start moving. Moving how? Defensively. He looked at her. Apollon is going to be exposed to pressure she hasn't been exposed to before. The investigation has been private for 9 years. After tomorrow, it's not private anymore. Hermione's expression went careful. Is she all right? I mean, is she's been ready for this for 9 years, Harry said. She built the entire investigation knowing this moment would come. He paused. She's not asking for help. She's informing me. He looked back at the fire. The 500 shifted in their quiet way, warm pressure moving through him like a tide. But I should be there. You can't leave Hogwarts during term. I'm aware. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to write to Dumbledore tomorrow and tell him what she found. Not everything, just enough. He needs to know the British political situation is about to change, and he needs to know it from me rather than finding out from the ministry and not knowing I already knew. Hermione looked at him. You're managing his information deliberately. I'm sharing what's useful in a way that establishes that I'm a source worth keeping current. He half smiled at her expression. It's not manipulation. It's architecture. That's what manipulation is, she said. No, he said, with some patience. Manipulation withholds truth to create a false picture. Architecture gives true information in a considered order to build an accurate picture that serves everyone. He paused. The difference matters. She thought about it. Wrote 2 more lines of her charms essay. Put the quill down. You learned this from her. Apollon. From watching her for 10 years, yes. What was that like? Growing up in that house? He considered the question. Around them the common room fire crackled and the portraits murmured in their sleep, and outside the windows the first proper November cold had arrived in Scotland, the kind that made the castle feel genuinely ancient rather than just old. Formative, he said, which made her look at him the same way Ron had on the train. He relented. Honest. She was always honest with me about everything. About what I carried and why. About the investigation and what it meant. About how complicated Dumbledore was, and how complicated the whole situation was, and why simple answers were almost always wrong. He looked at the fire. I had Fleur, who is, the most straightforwardly loyal person I know, in the way that loyalty looks like arguing with you constantly because she cares enough to be honest. And Gabrielle, who is 6 and smarter than most adults and has a diagram she thinks I might need for reference. He almost smiled. It was a good way to grow up. You miss them, Hermione said. Every day. He said it plainly, without drama. But I know where they are and I can write, and Voltaire is extremely committed to earning his bacon. It's fine. He paused. Hogwarts is interesting. It's a thing worth being at. Not because of the story about me, which is wrong in most of the important details, but because there are actual things happening here that matter, and Ron is unexpectedly excellent company, and you found Quirrell's frequency anomaly on your own in 11 days, which is, impressive is understating it. Hermione looked down at her essay. She had gone slightly pink. I just pay attention, she said. So does Apollon, he said. It's not a small thing. She picked up her quill. He pulled Apollon's letter from his pocket and read it a third time, slowly. The study wall had 278 names now. After tomorrow, it would have more. The hunt was no longer quiet, and the people it was hunting were going to feel that. Harry folded the letter and went to bed. Above the castle, the Scottish stars were extraordinary and entirely indifferent, and the 500 were warm in him in the way they always were on nights when something had changed, when the direction of things had shifted permanently and there was no going back to the shape the world had been before. He didn't want to go back. Forward was where the names were. Forward was where the answers lived. Chapter 4, The Names on the Wall. The French ministry's response took 48 hours. Harry knew this because Apollon wrote every day now, not long letters, not the kind that required careful decoding, but short precise dispatches, the kind military commanders sent when the campaign had entered its active phase. He read them at breakfast and folded them and put them in the locked box under his bed and went about his day. Day 1 after the dossier presentation, the minister received it. His face did 3 things in sequence. I am cautiously optimistic about the third one. Day 2, formal investigation opened. My name is in the public record now. For journalists have old. I will speak to none of them until I choose to. The British ministry has gone very quiet, which is exactly what I expected and exactly what concerns me. Day 3, Lucius Malfoy contacted the French ministry this morning. Not officially. Through a social channel, his wife's cousin holds a position in their diplomatic office. The contact was informal. Friendly. Completely deliberate. He is feeling the shape of what I've built and trying to find its edges. Harry read that one twice. Then he wrote back, he found an edge yet? Her response arrived the same evening, no. Because there are no edges. It is a wall. He set that one next to his bed rather than in the box. November moved through Hogwarts with the particular speed of a term that had too much in it. Classes, which Harry found largely straightforward in a way that would have worried him if he hadn't understood why, 500 compressed magical cores providing the kind of ambient magical literacy that made wand theory feel less like learning and more like confirmation of things he already sensed. Quidditch, which he'd been talked into trying out for by a Gryffindor second-year named Oliver Wood who had the energy of someone who considered losing a Quidditch match a genuine moral failing. He'd made the team as seeker in his first session, which produced a range of reactions across the school from impressed to openly skeptical to one memorable comment from a Slytherin fifth year that Harry had let pass unremarked because it was structurally boring. The Quirrell situation developed slowly, like weather. Harry and Hermione had built a picture, piece by piece, of what was behind the third-floor corridor, the stone, the traps protecting it, the specific magical signatures of each obstacle. Hermione had identified the logic puzzle component through a paper on Snape's published research, which had required getting into the restricted section, which she had managed with the particular determination she brought to problems she'd decided to solve. Harry had felt the final barrier through the floor above it one evening while walking the corridor deliberately. The last obstacle had a heat signature he recognized, the same specific dark residue that lived in Quirrell's classroom, and this told him something important. The traps weren't primarily for Quirrell. Quirrell was already inside them in some sense. The traps were for whoever came next. Which meant Dumbledore expected someone to come next. Which meant the stone being here was intentional bait for something larger. He had written this to Apollon. She had written back, correct. The question is what he expects to catch and what he plans to do with it when he does. Ron knew about Quirrell by now, not through deduction, because Ron's approach to most things was empirical rather than analytical, but through the much more direct method of having sat next to Harry in every defense class for 2 months and eventually saying, one evening in the common room, something is wrong with Quirrell, isn't it? Not a question. An observation, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has been watching and finally trusts the conclusion. Yes, Harry had said. What kind of wrong? The kind that's wearing his face. Ron had been quiet for a long time. Then, Voldemort's not dead. Not entirely. Ron's face went through several things. He landed on something that was a long way from afraid. Right, he said. What do we do about it? Which was, Harry thought, exactly the right question. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday. Not from Apollon. From the British Ministry, addressed to him directly, bypassing Dumbledore entirely, stamped with the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and marked personal and confidential in the particular way official letters were marked when they wanted to establish importance before you'd read a single word. He opened it at breakfast. Hermione watched him read it. Ron watched Hermione watch Harry. The letter was from Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He knew her name. She had a peripheral mention in the War Room files, someone who had been in the right position to know more than she'd officially recorded and had kept her hands cleaner than most. The letter said, Mr. Potter, I am writing to you directly because the matter I wish to discuss requires discretion I am not confident the standard channels will provide. Madame Delacour's investigation, of which I have now seen a substantial portion, has raised questions that fall within my department's jurisdiction. I would like to meet with you at your convenience to discuss the British dimension of what she has uncovered, specifically as it relates to individuals currently active in ministry operations. I understand if your trust in ministry officials is limited. It should be. This letter is an attempt to earn a portion of it. Amelia Bones, DMLE. He folded it and put it in his pocket and finished his porridge. Well? Ron said. Amelia Bones wants to meet. Ron sat up straight. She's the head of the, yes. That's, yes. Hermione was doing the rapid internal calculation he recognized by now. She bypassed Dumbledore, she said. She sent it directly to you at Hogwarts, which means she specifically did not route it through the headmaster's office. Why? Because she doesn't know whose side Dumbledore is on, Harry said. And neither do I, completely. And she's smart enough to know that. Is she trustworthy? She's cleaner than most. Her file suggests she's been blocked from investigating certain things for 20 years by people above her and has been building her own record of it. He paused. She's not clean because she's passive. She's clean because she was waiting for something worth moving for. And now she thinks that something is Apollon's investigation. Now she knows it is. He looked at Ron. What do you know about her? Ron thought about it. Dad says she's the best person in the ministry and the reason half the Aura department still functions. He paused. He also says she and Dumbledore have a relationship that is polite and completely cold, which at the ministry means they've disagreed about something important and neither of them has let it go. Harry nodded. I'm going to write to Apollon first. Then I'll respond to Bones. You're not going to tell Dumbledore? Not yet. Hermione looked at him. You're building architecture again. I'm establishing who knows what and in what order, he said. Before Dumbledore knows Bones has contacted me, I want to know what Bones knows. Because if Dumbledore finds out Bones contacted me first, his response to that tells me something I need to know. Ron looked from Harry to Hermione and back. I feel like my job in this is to be the person who points out when a plan sounds mad. That's an important job, Harry said. Does this sound mad? Ron considered. No, actually. It sounds like something my dad would do if he were braver about it. He pulled his pumpkin juice toward him. When are you going to tell Dumbledore about Quirrell? After I meet with Bones. So you're gathering, I'm building a complete picture before I show my hand, Harry said. That's different from hiding. He paused. Apollon spent 9 years doing this. Every name on the wall, every piece of evidence, every connection, all of it gathered and confirmed and cross-referenced before she moved. She didn't move early because moving early gives the people you're watching time to adjust. He looked at his hands. The people who need to face what they did have had 40 years of things moving slowly. I'm not in a hurry. Ron nodded slowly. Hermione was writing something, which probably meant she was already designing the next step without being asked. He went to find Voltaire. Apollon's response to his letter about Bones arrived in 6 hours, which was faster than usual and communicated more than the words did. She wrote, Bones is trustworthy within the following parameters. She is loyal to justice as a principle above institution, which makes her reliable in one direction and unpredictable in others. She has been trying to open the Pettigrew file for 7 years. She knows about Sirius Black. Meet her. Tell her about the wall. She will use the information correctly. Also, things have moved faster than I expected. Come home at the weekend. Bring Hermione Granger if she's willing. I have read her letters to her parents. She is going to be useful and she should see the study properly. He read the last paragraph 3 times. Apollon had never invited anyone to the estate before. Not peers. Not colleagues. Margaret Vasarely, yes, but she was decades of relationship, a professional bond built before Harry was born. Hermione Granger was 11 years old and had been at Hogwarts for 2 months. He went to find her. She was in the library. Of course she was. Apollon wants you to come to France this weekend, he said, sitting across from her. She looked up. Me. You. Why? Because she reads your letters to your parents, apparently, and finds you useful. He watched her process this. She has eyes in the French ministry who track correspondence flagged as magically significant. Your parents are Muggle, so your letters go through the regular post, but you write about magical subjects and the flag picks up the terminology. Hermione's expression went briefly through outrage. She reads private correspondence, and then through understanding, of course she does, and landed on something that was honest interest. She's been tracking me since I started at Hogwarts. Since before. Your name appeared in the Hogwarts registry, which is semi-public, and she researches anyone who will be in contact with me. He paused. It's protective, not invasive. She does it for everyone. She has a file on Ron that I've never read because it felt like cheating. What does she want to show me? The wall. He watched Hermione understand what that meant. She'd heard him mention it enough times to have a rough picture, but hearing and seeing were different things. He knew this from his own experience. The first time Apollon had taken him into the study at 7 and he'd seen the full wall, all 206 names that existed at that point in the investigation, the physical fact of that many people displayed that way, he had been quiet for a long time afterward. Not sad exactly. Something more complicated than sad. Yes, Hermione said. I want to come. They arrived on Saturday morning. Harry used the international flu in Hogsmeade, which required a short conversation with McGonagall that he'd been prepared for. She had agreed with the specific expression of someone who found the request unusual but found the requester more unusual and had decided trust was indicated. Ron had looked briefly like he wanted to come too, and Harry had said, with genuine regret, next time, which Ron had accepted with the grace of someone who understood without requiring it to be said that this particular trip had a specific purpose. The estate welcomed him the way it always did, the wards recognizing him, the air settling, the familiar weight of home pressing back against the specific lightness of being away from it. He stepped out of the flue and into the sitting room and Gabrielle was there, as though she'd been waiting exactly as long as was required and not a second longer. She looked at Hermione with the focused assessment of a 6-year-old who had inherited her mother's reading of people. Hermione looked back with the careful interest of someone meeting a child who was clearly more than they appeared. "You're Hermione Granger," Gabrielle said. "Yes. You're Gabrielle Delacour. Are you smart?" "Yes." Gabrielle considered this. "Good," she said. "Harry needs smart people." She held up a piece of parchment. "I have a new diagram. I found another lion connection." Harry took the diagram without breaking stride. "Where's Apollon?" "Study. She has someone with her." He looked at Gabrielle. She looked back with the expression she wore when the information she was holding was significant. "Who?" "A man from the British Ministry." She paused. "He came by flu. He has a grey coat and he looks like someone who is used to being the most important person in the room and is currently dealing with not being." Harry handed Hermione the diagram without comment and moved toward the study. The man in the grey coat was in his 50s, square-jawed, the kind of physically solid that had been impressive at 30 and was still formidable now if you didn't look at his eyes. His eyes were the problem. They had the slightly too careful quality of eyes that were performing steadiness rather than feeling it. He was sitting across from Apollon with a cup of tea he hadn't touched and the posture of someone who had come here with a prepared speech and had been listening for 20 minutes instead. Apollon was sitting behind her desk with her hands folded and her expression entirely neutral and a folder open in front of her that Harry recognized. It was the British Dimension Summary, the collated section of her investigation covering the 43 names connected to the British Ministry. She looked up when Harry came in. The man in the grey coat turned. "Marcus Flint," Apollon said. "Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic." She said it with the particular flatness that communicated she was giving him his title because it was relevant and not because it impressed her. "This is Harry Potter. I assume you know who he is." Flint looked at Harry with the eyes that were working too hard expression. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was controlled in the careful way of someone who had trained it to be. "Madame Delacour tells me you've been involved in the investigation." "Since I was 7, Harry said. He came fully into the room and stood beside Apollon's desk. He did not sit. He did not want to sit. He had assessed the geometry of the room and the standing position was correct for this conversation. "What does the minister want?" Flint blinked at the directness. "Recalibrated. He wants to understand the scope of what Madame Delacour intends to make public." "Everything," Harry said. "She intends to make everything public. That's the whole point. Some of the individuals named are, I know who they are." Harry looked at him steadily. "That's not news to anyone in this room. The question you're actually here to ask is whether there's a version of this where certain names don't appear in the public record, and the answer to that question is no." Flint's jaw tightened very slightly. The minister is trying to manage something that is past managing," Apollon said, which was the first thing she'd said since Harry entered the room, and she said it the way she said things she had been holding for exactly the right moment, quietly, without emphasis, and with the weight of absolute certainty behind it. "I have 409 confirmed names. I have documentary evidence for 312 of them. I have living witnesses for 187. I have signed testimonies for 63. She closed the folder. "The minister cannot manage this. He can only decide whether he wants to be the person who tried to stop it, or the person who helped it happen correctly." Flint was quiet. Harry watched him. The man was not stupid, that was apparent. He was doing the calculation that smart people did when the situation had moved past their original parameters, working out what was salvageable and what wasn't. The result of the calculation showed in his face slowly, the way comprehension shows in faces, the specific expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they don't like but can't argue with. "The minister would like a meeting," Flint said. "In London. Formal channel. He can make that request through the standard diplomatic process," Apollon said. "I will consider it." "There are timelines." "My timeline," Apollon said. Not his. Flint stood. He was trying to recover some version of the posture he'd arrived with and not quite managing it. He looked at Harry one more time, with the expression of someone reassessing an assumption they'd walked in with. Whatever he'd expected of a first year at Hogwarts, it wasn't this. He left. Apollon waited until she heard the flue activate. Then she stood, moved around the desk, and put her hand briefly on Harry's shoulder. "Good," she said. "He'll go straight to whoever sent him with the actual message," Harry said. "Of course." She moved to the window. "And the person who sent him with the actual message will now know that neither of us is manageable. Which changes what they try next." She looked at him. "Hermione?" "In the kitchen with Gabrielle." "Diagrams." Something in Apollon's expression shifted, not quite a smile, the thing adjacent to a smile. "Bring her in." Hermione stood in front of the wall for a very long time. She didn't speak. Harry stood back and let her look, the way Apollon had let him look, 9 years ago. The way you didn't rush someone looking at something true. Apollon sat at her desk and watched. The wall had grown substantially since Harry's last visit in August. The grid was tighter now, the cards organized in a system that had evolved over 9 years into something that communicated more in its arrangement than any index could, clusters of cards connected by thin lines of string, color-coded relationships, dates running in chronological tracks along the left margin. 409 names. Green and red and black corners. Some photographs. Some marginal notes so dense they'd overflowed onto attached sheets. Hermione moved along the wall slowly. Reading names, reading dates. Connecting things, Harry could tell, the rapid cross-referencing that was simply how her mind worked. She stopped at a section near the center. "These 6, she said. "They're all in the same 2-year window as the ones Gabrielle connected through Lion." "Yes," Apollon said. "They're British." "Yes." 3 of them are currently in ministry positions." "Yes." Hermione turned. Her face was doing something that Harry recognized from the platform at King's Cross when he'd first told her about the list, that moment of something settling that was more than intellectual comprehension. "How long have they been in those positions?" 2 of them were appointed in 1982, Apollon said. 1 was appointed in 1979. While it was happening. While it was happening. Hermione was very still. Who protected them? Apollon looked at her steadily. "That is the correct question," she said. "Most people who see this wall ask who did this. You asked who protected them. That is different and better." She paused. "The answer is plural. Some of them protected themselves, their positions made investigation politically costly. Some were protected by people who knew and made a calculation about what the cost of exposure would be versus the cost of silence." She paused. "Some were protected by people who didn't fully know what they were protecting and made their peace with not knowing." "Dumbledore," Hermione said. The room was quiet. "He didn't know the full scope," Harry said. "He's told Apollon that, and I believe it's true. He knew about the collection. He didn't know 500. He didn't investigate the British ministry dimension because he was managing a war and then managing its aftermath, and there were always reasons why this particular investigation had to wait." He paused. "The reasons were real. That doesn't make the waiting right." Hermione looked at him. "You're not angry at him." "I'm precise about him." He looked at the wall. "Anger doesn't help with Dumbledore. Clarity does." She turned back to the wall. Found a card in the upper left section. "Read it." "Sirius Black," she said. "You've got Sirius Black on here." "Not as a perpetrator," Apollon said. "As a victim. His wrongful imprisonment is part of what the investigation covers. It was enabled by the same network that protected the people who are on the other side of this wall. He's been in Azkaban for 10 years. "Yes. And Hermione looked at the card. He's listed as a priority. You're planning to get him out. I have been building the evidentiary case for his innocence since 1983, Apollon said. The Pettigrew documentation is complete. The witness testimony is complete. What remains is finding a mechanism to put it before the Wiesengemot in a way that doesn't allow it to be buried by the people on this wall who would be implicated by his exoneration. Harry had known this. He had known it for years, known it the way he knew all the components of the investigation, as facts, as pieces in a picture. But standing in the study hearing it said plainly, in Hermione's presence, something about the compound reality of it landed differently. Sirius Black. His godfather. In Azkaban for a decade. Because the network on this wall had needed a name to attach to Pettigrew's crime, and Sirius had been the convenient name, and the people who'd known better had said nothing because saying something cost more than silence. The fragment, Hermione said. She had moved to a different section of the wall, a smaller grid in the bottom right, with only 12 cards but with dense annotations, connected by red string rather than the neutral white used elsewhere. These 12. They're not victims. No, Apollon said. They're the ones who performed the extractions. The ones I've confirmed, yes. There were likely more. These are the ones with physical evidence. 3 of them are dead. 2 of those 3 died of causes unrelated to the investigation, Apollon said. One of them died in 1988, in Lyon. A pause. That one was not unrelated. Hermione looked at the card. Then at Apollon. Her expression was completely steady. You, she said. The French magical coroner recorded it as a cardiac event, Apollon said. He had a cardiac event. The fact that the cardiac event was preceded by a conversation in which I showed him documentation of what he had done and gave him the option of appearing before the Wiesengemot to answer for it, he chose not to exercise that option. Hermione was quiet for a moment. He frightened himself to death. Essentially. Because of what you showed him. Because of what he had done and the knowledge that it was no longer hidden, Apollon said. I showed him the truth. His heart responded to the truth. She looked at Hermione steadily. I did not harm him. I know. Hermione held her gaze. I know you didn't. She looked back at the wall. I just want to understand exactly what happened. That, Apollon said, is the correct instinct for someone who is going to work on things like this. She stood. Come to the desk. I want to show you the organizational system. Harry sat in the leather chair and watched Apollon walk Hermione through the architecture of 9 years, the index, the cross-reference system, the evidence tiers, the distinction between confirmed names and suspected names and names requiring further investigation. He watched Hermione absorb it with the focused absorption of someone being handed something they didn't know they'd been waiting for. He watched Apollon watch Hermione and do the same reading she'd done the night she'd found Harry in the rubble, that deep assessment, the weighing of what a person was. Gabrielle appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and her new diagram tucked under her arm. I added the lion connection, she told Apollon, setting the cups down. And I found something else. These 3 names, she pointed at the diagram with the authority of someone who is completely certain, they're all connected to the same Hogwarts house. Harry looked at the diagram. He felt something move through him, not the 500 exactly, but something adjacent to them, the specific sensation he got when pieces aligned into a shape that had been waiting to become visible. Which house, he said. Gabrielle looked at him with her clear, unsettling eyes. Slytherin, she said. All 3. Same era, same decade. And one of them has a son who is currently at Hogwarts. The study was very quiet. Harry looked at Apollon. Malfoy. Malfoy, she confirmed. Lucius Malfoy is connected to 2 of those 3 names through financial records I obtained from Gringotts last year. The 3rd connection I have been waiting to confirm. She looked at him. How is his son? Watching me, Harry said. Carefully. From a distance. He's been recalibrating since the sorting. He's his father's son, Apollon said. He'll try to establish a dynamic before Christmas. A social one. Malfoy operates through hierarchy. He'll want to know where you sit. He already knows I don't sit where he expects. Then he'll want to know where you actually sit. She picked up her tea. Don't tell him. Let him look. Harry nodded. He thought about the grey coat man, Marcus Flint, already fleeing back to London with his report. He thought about Lucius Malfoy receiving that report, or a version of it, through whatever channel connected them. He thought about the shape of what was moving now, the investigation entering its public phase, the ministry trying to find edges that didn't exist, the people on the wall beginning to feel the walls close. Amelia Bones wants to meet, he said. I know. Write back tonight. Tell her yes. My sitting room, not her office. Apollon set her cup down. She needs to see the wall too. Everyone needs to see the wall, Gabrielle said, with great seriousness. Hermione looked at the wall one more time. At the 409 cards. At the green and red and black corners. At the names, each one a person, each one a debt that hadn't been paid. What happens, she said slowly, when you've got all 500 confirmed? When the evidence is complete? Then we go to the Wisengamot, Apollon said. And if the Wisengamot is compromised? If the people on that wall have enough influence to, then we go above the Wisengamot, Apollon said simply. To the International Confederation of Wizards. To the European Magical Court. To every tribunal and every legal mechanism available until one of them works. She looked at the wall. There is no version of this where it stays buried. I decided that the night I found him. She didn't gesture at Harry. Didn't need to. I have been building something that has no single point of failure. You cannot stop it by removing one person or one piece of evidence or one witness, because every component is backed by 3 others. You cannot discredit it because the evidence chains are independent. You cannot outlast it because I have been at this for 9 years and I am not tired. The room held that. Then Hermione Granger, who had read more books than most adult wizards and was going to spend the rest of her life being underestimated by people who should know better, turned from the wall and looked at Apollon and said, "What can I do?" They took the Floo back to Hogwarts on Sunday evening. Harry had the new diagram from Gabrielle, a sealed letter from Apollon to Amelia Bones, and the familiar settling back into place that happened when the estate received him again after time away, the understanding, cellular and complete, of where he belonged. In the Gryffindor common room, Ron was waiting with chess and the expression of someone who had spent the weekend with his own thoughts and had things to say. Harry sat down. Ron set up the pieces. "Fred and George," Ron said. "They've been asking about you." "What kind of asking?" "The kind where they want to know if you're as interesting as you seem." Ron moved his pawn. "I told them yes." "What did they say?" "They said good." "They've been bored." Ron looked at the board. "Also, Malfoy did something on Saturday." Harry looked up. "He cornered Neville in the library," Ron said. "Not threatening. Worse, friendly. Asking about his family, about his parents. The kind of friendly that's actually a knife." His jaw was set. Neville didn't know how to handle it. He looked, it was bad. Harry was quiet for a moment. Neville Longbottom. His parents were on the wall. Frank and Alice Longbottom, their minds destroyed, not their cores stripped but their sanity shattered by a related group of people in the same network, and their son was at Hogwarts being casually maneuvered by Lucius Malfoy's son because the generational rot ran deep and didn't trouble itself about age. "Where is Neville now?" Harry said. "Common room. He's fine. I sat with him." Ron paused. "Is his family, is it connected?" "His parents are on the wall," Harry said. "Different section. The people who hurt them are related to the investigation." He looked at Ron. "He deserves to know eventually." Not from me. But eventually. What do we do about Malfoy? Harry thought about Apollin's words, let him look. About the grey coat man and the careful calculation of who knew what in what order. About the fact that Draco Malfoy was 11 years old and the son of a man who had facilitated the collection of stolen magic cores, and the question of how much of what Draco did was his father's instruction versus his own nature was real and worth taking seriously. Nothing yet, he said. But make sure Neville knows he doesn't have to navigate Malfoy alone. Ron nodded, moved his knight. Done. They played for an hour. Harry lost the first game, which Ron managed with the grace of someone who wins enough to feel comfortable about it without rubbing it in, which Harry found genuinely pleasant. He won the second. Ron demanded a third, which Harry declined because Voltaire was giving him the look that meant there was a letter. He took the letter. Opened it. Amelia Bones, responding to his message sent that morning before the flu. Short, direct, already so much cleaner than Flint's carefully constructed sentences. Saturday. France. I'll come to you. I have something you need to see. And below that, in smaller letters, I've been building my own file for 3 years. I think ours might fit together. Harry read it twice. The 500 shifted in their quiet, warm way. He sat for a moment and felt the investigation moving through its phases, the years of careful architecture becoming something kinetic, something that couldn't be stopped by one hand because it was too many hands now, too many pieces moving, too many people who had decided that the comfortable quiet of not knowing was over. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban. About 10 years. About a man who had stood in a dark lane with grief making wreckage of his face and got back on his motorcycle and went to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. He thought about 500 names on a wall. He thought about what Apollon had said in the study, there is no version of this where it stays buried. He picked up his quill. He wrote back to Amelia Bones, Saturday. Come early. There's a lot to show you. He sealed it. He gave it to Voltaire, who received it with dignity and departed immediately into the Scottish night, and somewhere above the dark lock in the ancient castle walls, an owl carried the next piece of something enormous northward into the dark. The wall kept growing. The names kept coming. And the people on the other side of the wall, the ones with red corners and the ones who had thought red corners would never have their names attached to them, were beginning, finally and irreversibly, to understand that the counting was almost done. Chapter 5, The Trial That Wasn't the Summons arrived on a Wednesday. Not to Harry, to Apollon, directly, delivered by a British ministry owl that arrived at the estate in Lyon with the particular self-importance of official correspondence that had been sent by someone who expected compliance. The owl was large, grey, and had the bearing of an animal that knew it carried something significant and wanted credit for it. Apollon fed it anyway, because it wasn't the owl's fault. She wrote to Harry the same morning, 2 lines, the Wisengamot has summoned me. Formal hearing, 3 weeks. They are calling it an inquiry into unlicensed magical practice and interference with ministry investigations. Come home at Christmas. We have work to do. Harry read it at breakfast. Ron watched him read it, which meant Ron saw his face. What happened? Ron said. They moved, Harry said. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting something like this since the French ministry formal investigation had gone public, since Amelia Bones had spent 4 hours in Apollon's study 2 weeks ago and had gone home with copies of 212 evidence documents and an expression that was part fury and part the specific relief of someone who has been right about something for years and has finally found the proof. He'd been expecting a countermove. The Wisengamot summons was the move, formally neutral, officially procedural, structured as an inquiry into Apollon's conduct rather than as a response to her findings, which was elegant, actually. He could appreciate the elegance even while recognizing it as completely transparent. Hermione was reading over his shoulder. She'd been doing this for weeks, reading his letters before he said anything about them, which he'd stopped minding around the same time he'd stopped minding that she corrected his charms theory 3 times a class. They're inverting it, she said. She's the investigator and they're making her the subject. Yes. That's very good strategy if you're afraid of what the investigator has found, he said. Forces her to spend preparation time and political capital defending her methods instead of advancing her evidence. Can they make it stick? If the hearing is conducted by people on the wall, yes. He folded the letter. Which is why we need to make sure it isn't. Ron was looking back and forth between them in the way that had become his characteristic expression for their planning conversations, slightly exasperated, entirely committed, the face of a man who had accepted that his life now included things he hadn't prepared for and had decided this was fine. How do you stop the Wiesengemot from stacking a hearing? You make it more expensive to stack it than to run it honestly, Harry said. You do that by making sure the right people know, in advance, what the hearing actually is and what it will look like if it goes the wrong way. He stood. I need to write to Amelia Bones. And I need to write to Dumbledore. Hermione's eyebrows went up. Dumbledore. He's the supreme mugwump. He has procedural authority over Wiesengemot hearings when he chooses to exercise it. Harry picked up his bag. He hasn't chosen to exercise it yet. It's time to give him a reason to. He found Voltaire after breakfast and sent 2 letters. Then he went to Transfiguration and was slightly ahead of McGonagall's lesson on inanimate to animate conversion because he'd read the relevant chapter 3 days ago, and he spent most of the class thinking about architecture while his matches turned into needles with what McGonagall described, in a tone that conveyed she found competence suspicious until proven otherwise, as passable precision. Dumbledore's response came that evening, delivered not by owl but by a small flame that appeared in Harry's dormitory fireplace and left a rolled note in the grate. The note said, Harry. My office, tonight, 8 o'clock, if you're willing. A.D. Harry went at 8. The headmaster's office was exactly as strange as the rest of the castle, occupied by 15 years of accumulated eccentricity, the spinning instruments, the portraits of former headmasters, the bird that was definitely a phoenix and that turned its magnificent head to look at Harry with the slow gravity of something that has been alive through enough history to find most things familiar. Dumbledore was standing at the window when Harry came in. He turned. Thank you for coming, he said, and meant it. Harry sat down across from the desk. Dumbledore sat. Between them, the instruments spun and ticked in their quiet industry. The summons, Harry said. Yes. Dumbledore folded his hands. I want you to know that I didn't know about it before it was sent. I know. Bones old me the same morning to tell me she didn't either. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. Which means it came from somewhere that could move without alerting either of you. Fudge's office. Almost certainly. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Cornelius is, not corrupt in the active sense. But he has surrounded himself with people who are, and he has developed a habit of not asking questions whose answers would require him to act. He paused. He knows about the investigation. He has known for 6 months. He has been hoping it would resolve itself without requiring him to do anything. Sending a Wiesengemot summons is doing something. It's doing something that looks like institutional oversight while actually being obstruction, Dumbledore said. Which is Cornelius's particular talent. He looked at Harry carefully. What do you need from me? The directness surprised Harry. He let it. She needs the hearing to be clean, Harry said. Uncompromised panel. Someone with procedural authority present who will enforce fair conduct. He paused. She also needs to not go in as the subject of the inquiry. She needs to go in as the source of evidence. That's a significant reframing. It's the accurate framing. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The blue eyes behind the half-moon glasses were doing their particular thing, the thing Harry had observed in the estate twice and now recognized as Dumbledore's actual thinking face, stripped of performance, just the working of a genuinely extraordinary mind on a genuine problem. You want me to restructure the hearing, he said. Formally. As Supreme Mugwump. I want you to use the authority you have to make sure what happens in that room is what is supposed to happen in that room, Harry said. Nothing more than that. Some of the people who will be implicated by Apollin's evidence sit on the Wisengamot. I know. This will end careers. Multiple careers. It will restructure the ministry's upper echelon. I know. It will also, Dumbledore said, carefully, make a number of things politically complicated for me. I know that too, Harry said. And I'm not asking you to do it because it's comfortable. I'm asking you because you have the power to make it fair, and making it fair is the right thing, and you know it's the right thing, and the reason you haven't done it already is that you've been waiting to see what happens without your direct intervention. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Stop waiting. She's been building this for 9 years. She has everything. All she needs is a room that isn't rigged. The fire crackled. Fawkes made a sound that might have been agreement. There are things about you, Dumbledore said slowly, that remind me of your mother. The directness. The particular quality of not being afraid of the truth. He paused. And things that remind me of your father. The strategic patience. The ability to wait for exactly the right moment. Another pause. And things that remind me of neither of them, that are entirely your own. Is that relevant? Harry said, not unkindly. No, Dumbledore said. Not to the decision. He unfolded his hands and picked up a quill. I will exercise my authority as Supreme Mugwump to designate this as a formal evidentiary hearing rather than a conduct inquiry. The distinction matters procedurally, it shifts the burden and the panel composition. He was writing as he spoke. I will also request the presence of the European Magical Court Observer, which triggers independent oversight protocols and prevents the hearing from being closed to the record. He looked up. That last part is going to make Cornelius extraordinarily unhappy. Good, Harry said. Something in Dumbledore's expression moved, the corner of his mouth, just slightly. You're going to be a great deal of trouble for a very long time, he said, with something in his voice that was exactly the opposite of a complaint. Only for the people who deserve it, Harry said. He went back to Gryffindor Tower and wrote to Apollin, Dumbledore is in. European Court Observer requested. Go in as the source, not the subject. 3 weeks is enough. Her response, the next morning, was 5 words, I have been ready. Good. Christmas at the estate was the same and different. Jean-Pierre cooked with the focused abundance he brought to occasions that mattered. Gabrielle had produced 3 new diagrams in the intervening weeks and presented them at dinner with the formality of a professional briefing, which Jean-Pierre received with the particular expression of a parent watching their child do something extraordinary and trying to be calm about it. Fleur was home from Beauxbatons for the holiday, and she was 17 now, and she had grown into the specific version of herself that made Harry occasionally feel like he was looking at a portrait that had learned to move, something brilliant and precise that was also, underneath all the precision, the same person who had taught him French by refusing to speak English and had sat with him on the floor of the war room at 14 saying do you want to talk about it when the weight of the wall had been, briefly, too heavy. She pulled him into the kitchen on the first night while Apollin and Jean-Pierre and Gabrielle were in the sitting room. How bad, she said. Not bad, he said. Moving. It's moving. The hearing. 3 weeks. He leaned against the counter. Dumbledore restructured the format. It's an evidentiary hearing now, not a conduct inquiry. The European Court Observer has confirmed. Bones is presenting a joint submission. Fleur was quiet for a moment. She was making tea, which she did the way she did everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, the product arriving without drama. And you? What are you doing at the hearing? I'm attending. She looked at him. As myself. Apollin's family. And as the person who carries the evidence. He paused. Literally. Whatever case anyone makes about what was done, I am the most direct possible physical proof that it happened. They'll try to use that against her. Against both of you. They'll try, he agreed. The argument will be that placing a child with knowledge of an ongoing investigation constitutes coaching a witness or worse. He picked up the tea she set in front of him. The counter-argument is that I'm not a witness. I'm what the crime was done to. You can't coach a scar. Fleur was looking at him with the expression she rarely showed anyone outside the family, stripped of the armor, the real version, where the concern sat right at the surface without apology. Are you all right? Not strategically. Actually. He thought about it honestly, because she always required honesty and he had never found a reason not to give it to her. I'm better than I expected to be, he said. There's something about it being real now, about it being out, the investigation public, the hearing confirmed, that's different from the anticipation. The anticipation was heavier. He looked at his tea. The 500 have been different lately. More, settled. Like they know something is happening. They're not conscious, Fleur said carefully. No. But they're not nothing either. He looked at her. It feels like the right thing happening at the right time. Not easy. Not clean. But right. He paused. I'm ready. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her own tea. I'm coming to the hearing, she said. Not a question. I know, he said. I already told Apollon to expect you. She made the laugh-sigh sound. He had missed that sound. The Weisengamot hearing was on a Tuesday in January, which was an ordinary day in every possible respect except that it wasn't. They arrived at the Ministry of Magic at 9:30, which was half an hour before the scheduled hearing, which was one of Apollon's principles. You did not give a room time to settle into an arrangement before you arrived in it. You arrived early and you made the room arrange around you. The ministry atrium was enormous and self-important and full of the particular energy of a workplace that knew something significant was happening and was pretending it didn't. Witches and wizards moved through the golden flow streams and across the polished floor with carefully managed expressions. Several of them looked at Apollon as she crossed the atrium and then looked away with the speed of people who had made a decision about how to feel and needed to sustain it. Harry walked with her. Fleur was on his right. Gabrielle, who had been brought because Apollon had decided she was old enough and because sending her home would have been a larger battle than the hearing itself, was just behind them with Jean-Pierre. Margit Vasarely was there too, because the hearing would require expert testimony about magical core structure, and there was exactly one person in Europe qualified to give it. Amelia Bones met them outside the courtroom. She was in formal robes, her characteristic monocle, and the expression of someone who had not slept properly in 3 weeks and had decided this was an acceptable price. She shook Apollon's hand with the directness of people who have communicated enough in writing to skip the preliminary warmth. 53 of the 409 names are connected to active ministry personnel, Bones said without preamble. 14 of those are in senior positions. I have flagged 5 for immediate suspension pending the hearing's outcome, which I did this morning, which the minister does not yet know about. When he finds out, Apollon said, he'll be very unhappy. Bones's expression communicated she found the prospect entirely manageable. He's also not going to be in a position to reverse it today, because the European Court observer is already seated in the chamber and reversing the suspensions before the hearing would constitute interference with an active proceeding. She paused. I learned a thing or two about architecture. Harry looked at Apollon. She didn't look back, but something in her posture communicated that she had noticed. They went in. The courtroom was stone and ancient and designed to communicate the weight of institutional authority, which was a thing it did effectively regardless of whether the institution was using that authority well. The Weisengamot members were seated in tiers around the central floor, 60-odd witches and wizards in plum-colored robes, their faces running the full range from visibly uncomfortable to aggressively neutral to, in a few cases, the specific stillness of people who had known this day was coming and had been dreading it. Dumbledore was in the chair of the Supreme Mugwump, elevated slightly, with the air of a man who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. He caught Harry's eye when they entered. Something passed between them, not warmth exactly, more like acknowledgement, the quiet recognition of an agreement being honored. In the public gallery above, Harry could see people who had no official reason to be here. Journalists. Ministry staff. And, he looked carefully, several faces he didn't recognize, people who had the particular quality of presence that came from having personal stakes in what was happening. Families, some of them, he thought. People who had lost someone to the names on the wall. People who had been told for decades that they had no case, no recourse, nowhere to take what had been done to them. They were here. Lucius Malfoy was seated in the Waisengamot. Harry had known he would be. He was a member, had been for 12 years, appointed to his seat in 1980, which was a date that appeared in the War Room files in proximity to 3 other dates that were not coincidental. He sat in the upper tier with the posture of a man completely at ease, his cane across his knees, his expression the carefully composed neutrality of someone who had operated in rooms like this for long enough to treat them as his natural habitat. He looked at Harry when Harry came in. Harry looked back. Neither of them looked away for a moment, which communicated several things, and then Lucius Malfoy redirected his gaze to the front of the chamber with the smooth movement of someone changing a subject. Harry sat beside Apollon at the central floor table. Hermione was in the gallery, scribbling already. Ron was beside her, arms crossed, jaw set, looking at the assembled Waisengamot with the expression of a person whose father had spent 20 years in this building watching it work badly. Dumbledore opened the hearing. This proceeding, he said, with the particular carrying quality of his voice that made it fill a room without apparent effort, is designated as a formal evidentiary hearing under Section 14 of the Waisengamot Charter, which supersedes the original inquiry designation. The subject of this hearing is the evidence compiled and submitted by Apollon Delacour regarding the systematic criminal practice of magical core extraction carried out within the United Kingdom and across European jurisdictions between 1968 and 1981. A pause. I remind all members that the rules of evidentiary hearings apply. All submissions are entered into the permanent record. No evidence may be suppressed by procedural motion without a majority vote subject to immediate review by the European Court observer. He looked at the room over his glasses. We will proceed in order. There was a sound in the chamber, not a sound exactly, more the absence of the sounds that had been present a moment before, a collective held breath. Apollon stood. She did not use notes. Harry had seen her prepare for this for weeks, had sat with her in the study, had watched her organize and sequence and strip out everything that wasn't essential. What she presented now was not a performance and it was not a plea. It was architecture. She laid out the investigation the same way she had built it, piece by piece, each element connected to the next, the logic of it self-supporting and complete. She started with the night of November 1, 1981. The ruins of Godric's Hollow. A 1-year-old child radiating a magical signature that had no precedent in recorded history. She described what she'd found in specific terms that were precise without being clinical, the number, the density, the evidence of deliberate collection and storage. She described the identification methodology, the Veela bloodline reading technique, and why it was uniquely capable of distinguishing individual magical signatures from a compressed collection. She then walked through the first confirmed names. The earliest ones, 1968, 1969. She read them aloud. Each name landed in the room differently. Some of the Waisengamot members were writing. Some were very still. Margit Basartley presented the technical testimony. She was 70 years old and had the demeanor of someone who had never in her life modulated their presentation for a hostel room. She presented in the precise, unhurried language of an expert who knew her field completely and was not particularly interested in whether you kept up. The methodology was airtight. The cross-referencing was documented. The chain of evidence was intact from the original readings through the current files. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody was willing to interrupt her. Bones presented the ministry dimension. The 5 suspensions. The 14 active ministry personnel with connections to the named network. The 3 British nationals among the 12 confirmed core extractors. She presented each piece with the flat delivery of someone who had been waiting for this specific room for 3 years and was now, with great professional restraint, not expressing the full scope of what she felt about having arrived in it. The chamber was very quiet. Then a Wisengamot member in the third tier, a man Harry identified as one of the names on the wall, peripherally connected, green corner, still living and still here, stood and said, in a voice that was doing its best to sound procedural, "I move that the evidence chain be referred to a review committee before." Motion declined, Dumbledore said, without looking up from the papers in front of him. The man sat down. Another member, higher up, said, "The methods used to obtain certain financial records may not be. All financial records in this submission were obtained through Gringotts standard legal disclosure process triggered by official investigation status," Bones said, without turning around. "The documentation is in Exhibit 47. Silence. Lucius Malfoy had not moved. Had not spoken. Had not shifted the angle of his body or changed the quality of his expression. He was watching the hearing with the stillness of a man who was very good at rooms like this and was currently deciding something. Apollon called her final witness. Harry stood. He walked to the witness position in the center of the floor, a raised stone circle that was designed for exactly this, for the person giving testimony to be seen from every angle, and he stood in it and looked at the assembled Wisengamot and felt, for the first time in the chamber, the 500 shift significantly. Not distress. Something closer to recognition. This room, this moment, the specific shape of what was happening. He knew what was coming. He had discussed it with Apollon and Margit and Bones. He had, in a brief conversation 2 weeks ago, discussed it with Dumbledore, who had listened and then been quiet for a long moment and then said, "Are you certain?" and Harry had said, "Yes." Apollon said, "You are aware of what you carry?" "Yes," Harry said. "Describe it." He did. He described it the way he'd learned to, not technically, not in Margit's precise clinical language, but in the language of actual experience. What it felt like. The warmth. The layers. The way they moved in certain situations. The specific sensation of standing in this room right now, which was like standing at the center of something that had been waiting for this location for a long time. Have you ever attempted to access the individual cores? Apollon asked. No. They are not mine. Can you identify them? Apollon can, he said. Through direct bloodline reading. I can feel the number and the density but not the individual signatures. She can read each one specifically. And the soul fragment? A sound moved through the chamber. Not a word, just movement, breath, shifting, the physical response of a room to a word it had been trying not to hear. It was identified in November 1981, Harry said, by Margit Visarhli. It was stabilized and reduced in August of this year through bloodline extraction work conducted by Apollon and Margit together. It is currently dormant. He looked at the chamber steadily. It is a fragment of Voldemort's soul. The sound that moved through the room this time was more substantial. He used the collection as an anchor, Harry continued, with the calm of someone reciting known facts. When his attempt at the Potters failed, the compressed cores were blasted into the nearest available magical vessel. They carried the fragment with them. I have been carrying it since I was 1 year old. He paused. I did not ask for it. The people whose cores were taken did not ask for any of it. They were robbed of the most fundamental aspect of their magical personhood so that a Dark Lord could have an anchor, and the people who facilitated that robbery have spent 14 years in this building, and in buildings like it, without facing what they did. The chamber was absolutely silent. Harry looked at Lucius Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy looked back. And Harry said, clearly, with the precise weight of someone who has been preparing a sentence for years, I know what you facilitated, and I know when, and I know the names of the people you worked with, and so does Apollon, and so does Amelia Bones, and so does the European Court Observer, and there is no version of today where that stops being true because of what you do next. The silence extended. Malfoy's expression did not change. But something behind it did, the specific shift of a man who has been calculating and has arrived at a number he doesn't like. Then he stood up. Harry watched him. The room watched him. Apollon, at the table behind Harry, was completely still. Malfoy said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled and contained absolutely no acknowledgement that anything had touched him, "I move to adjourn the hearing pending a full review of the submission's legal standing under." Motion declined, Dumbledore said. The submission contains evidence obtained through French investigative authority which has not been. The French investigative authority's findings have been formally accepted under the Bilateral Magical Cooperation Treaty of 1963, Bones said. Article 7, Subsection 4. The testimony of a minor in matters that directly affect that minors, is explicitly protected and admissible under Section 21 of the Wiesengemot Evidentiary Standards, said the European Court Observer, a woman Harry had not yet heard speak, in a voice that communicated she had been listening for exactly this and had her answer ready. Mr. Potter is not a party to the hearing. He is a living piece of evidence. The distinction is material. Malfoy stood with the motion dying in the air around him. "Sit down, Lucius," Dumbledore said quietly. And he did. He sat down with the controlled motion of a man making a dignified retreat and the eyes of someone filing things away for later, and Harry watched him do it and thought about Draco in the Hogwarts library asking Neville questions shaped like weapons, and thought about the card in the war room and the red string and the 9 years of building, and turned back to face the front of the chamber. The hearing continued for 4 hours. At the end of it, Dumbledore called for an immediate vote on 3 measures: the formal opening of a criminal investigation into the named individuals, the suspension of all named active ministry personnel pending the investigation's outcome, and the referral of the Sirius Black case for immediate Wiesengemot review based on the Pettigrew documentation Apollon submitted in Exhibit 83. The vote on the first measure passed 41 to 19. The vote on the second passed 38 to 22. The vote on the third passed unanimously, because nobody in the chamber, by the end of 4 hours of Apollon's architecture, wanted to be the person who voted against reviewing the wrongful imprisonment of a man whose case had been in Apollon's files since 1983. Lucius Malfoy voted yes on all 3. Harry noticed this. He filed it away. In the gallery, Hermione was writing so fast her hand was a blur. Ron was gripping the railing with both hands and had the expression of someone who was feeling several large things at once and was managing by focusing all of them into the physical grip. Several of the faces Harry had identified as families, people with personal stakes, were very still in the particular way of people who have been waiting so long for a specific thing to happen that when it does the body doesn't know how to respond. In the corridor outside the chamber, afterward, a woman approached Apollon. She was in her 50s, unremarkable in appearance, wearing Muggle clothes. She had been in the gallery. She looked at Apollon and her voice was very quiet and she said, in French-accented English, "My son. Didier Laurent. He is on your wall." Apollon looked at her. "Green corner," she said. "Living. He lost his magic in 1979 and was told it was spontaneous degradation." The woman's face did something enormous. "He is alive. He is alive. I have his current address." Apollon reached into her coat and produced a folded paper, which she offered. "I have been waiting to give you this." The woman took it with both hands. She held it and looked at it and then looked at Apollon with the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they had been walking toward for a very long time without knowing where it ended. "Thank you," she said, which was not enough and was also exactly enough. Harry watched this. He felt the 500 move through him in their warm, sourceless way, and this time it was more distinct than usual, not individual, not specific, but gathered, collective, the feeling of a group of things that have been waiting and are now, in some indefinable way, less distant from where they need to be. Fleur was beside him. She had been in the gallery and had come down and was now standing close without saying anything, which was Fleur's specific version of support, present, solid, not requiring the moment to perform itself for her. "How do you feel?" she said, eventually. He thought about it. "Like it's not over," he said. "But like the shape of it has changed." "In what direction?" Forward, he said. It moved forward. She nodded. Didn't say anything else. He appreciated that. Dumbledore came out of the chamber 20 minutes later, after the formal record had been sealed and the court observer had completed her notation. He found Harry in the corridor, which Harry thought was intentional, and he said, without anything extraneous, "That was well done." "Apollon built it," Harry said. "I just showed up." "You showed up and said the right things to the right people at the right moment," Dumbledore said. "That is not nothing." He paused. "The Sirius Black review will be expedited. I will personally ensure it." Another pause. "There are things I should have done sooner. I am aware of that." "I know you're aware," Harry said. "Does it help?" "That I'm aware?" Harry considered this seriously. "It helps that you're doing something about it now," he said. "The awareness without the action doesn't do much for anyone." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Your mother would have said exactly that," he said. "In precisely that order." He turned. "Go home, Harry. You've earned a night that doesn't require strategy." He walked back into the chamber. Harry looked at the corridor, at the ministry walls around him, at the polished floors and the torchlight and the institutional weight of a building that had been doing things the wrong way for a very long time and was now, under considerable duress, beginning to do some of them differently. He thought about the wall at the estate. 409 names. The green and red and black corners. The string connecting them in their clusters, the evidence tiers, the 9 years of quill marks in Apollon's precise hand. He thought about Sirius Black. He thought about Pettigrew's documentation in Exhibit 83, the chain of evidence Apollon had built from a combination of ministry records and testimony from 4 witnesses who had all individually been told their accounts were insufficient, and which were now, combined, cross-referenced, confirmed, sufficient beyond any reasonable standard. He thought about the soul fragment, dormant in him, and about Voldemort's return which was coming regardless of what happened in Wisengamot Chambers, and about Quirrell still walking the halls of Hogwarts with something wearing his face, and about the stone behind the third-floor corridor. There was still so much to do. He found Apollon outside the atrium, standing in the cold January air with her coat on and her expression entirely composed and a look in her eyes that was specific to the end of a very long, very focused effort, not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter and more durable than either. He stood beside her. She looked at him. 226 names left to confirm, she said. The investigation isn't over. I know. The people who voted no in there today, I memorized them. There will be consequences from Malfoy, I know. And Voldemort is coming. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the London air was cold and grey and full of the Muggle city's continuous motion, the sound of it underlying everything, the irreducible noise of a world going on. You were extraordinary today, she said. He looked at her. You built it. You carried it, she said. There is a difference. You've been carrying it since you were 1 year old and you've carried it without complaint and without bitterness, and today you stood in that room and you used it for what it was always meant to be used for. She looked at him directly. I am proud of you in a way I don't have adequate language for. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She put her arm around his shoulders, briefly, and they stood in the cold air outside the Ministry of Magic while the city moved around them, and inside him the 500 were the quietest they had ever been, not absent, not gone, just settled, deeply and finally resting in the particular way of things that have taken one significant step toward where they were always meant to go. The wall still had 226 names to add. The hunt was still running. But today, 41 families were going to get letters. 38 ministry officials were going to face investigations. Sirius Black's case was going to a review that would, finally, go the right way. And Lucius Malfoy had voted yes on all 3 measures, which meant he was either cutting his losses or building towards something, and Harry was going to be watching him every single day until he knew which one it was. There was still so much to do. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. The instability started in March. Not with a dramatic signal, not with pain or collapse or anything that announced itself as significant. It started the way most significant things started, with something small that Harry almost dismissed. He was in charms, third period on a Tuesday, when Flitwick asked the class to attempt a switching spell, and Harry raised his wand and felt something inside him that had never moved before. Not the 500. Something else. Something deeper. It was like a fault line responding to pressure, a deep vibration in the architecture of his core, structural, fundamental. Not painful. But wrong in the specific way that a sound is wrong when a building is doing something buildings shouldn't do. He performed the switching spell. It worked perfectly. He put his wand down and spent the rest of the class very quietly mapping what he'd felt. He wrote to Apollon that evening, something shifted today. Not the 500. The fragment. It moved. Her response came in 3 hours. I felt it from here. Margaret is already on her way to you. Do not attempt any high-output magic until she arrives. This is not negotiable. He wrote back, understood. How bad? Her response, ask Margaret. I need to speak to Dumbledore tonight. That told him more than a detailed answer would have. Margaret arrived the following morning, which meant she had left Lyon the same evening Apollon's letter went out. She came through the Hogwarts floor with the demeanor of someone who had been traveling through the night and considered this an entirely reasonable thing to do. McGonagall met her in the entrance hall. Dumbledore had clearly prepared the ground, and brought her to the hospital wing, where Harry was waiting with Hermione and Ron, both of whom had been told enough to understand that the situation had shifted and were responding by being exactly themselves, Ron solidly present and not asking redundant questions, Hermione with a notebook open and 3 texts she'd pulled from the library already cross-referenced and tabbed. Margaret set her bag down, looked at Harry, and said without preamble, when did Quirrell arrive at this school? Harry blinked. September. And the fragment has been stable until now. Yes. She sat across from him and reached out, and he gave her his wand hand, and she held it between both of hers and went very still. Her eyes unfocused in the way they did when she was reading, the deep reading, the bloodline magic working. He had been through this enough times to know the rhythm of it, to stay still and let her work. She was quiet for nearly 4 minutes. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was very controlled. The fragment is resonating, she said. In response to a proximate source. Something here is amplifying its signal. Something close to you. Something that carries the same original magical signature. She looked at him. Quirrell. Quirrell is the proximate source, Harry said. Whatever is in Quirrell is the proximate source, she corrected. The fragment recognizes its origin. 2 pieces of the same thing, in close enough proximity for long enough, they begin to call to each other. The fragment has been trying to move toward its source since September. You've been suppressing it without knowing you were doing it. How long before it stops being suppressible? She was quiet for a moment. Weeks. Not months. She paused. It needs to come out. The extraction I said we'd do in a few years, we need to do it now. Is that safe? Ron said, from the corner where he and Hermione had been listening. Safer than the alternative, Margaret said. What's the alternative? Hermione said. The fragment finds a way to answer the call, Margaret said. And given sufficient proximity and sufficient time, the 500 cores, which have been providing Harry's core with an extraordinary pressure system, provide the blast radius for an event that will be difficult to contain. The hospital wing was quiet. How difficult, Harry said. Catastrophic, Margaret said plainly. The 500 cores compressed in your core responding to a Dark Lord's resonance signal is not a small magical event. It is the kind of event that reshapes landscapes. She looked at him steadily. I am not being dramatic. I am being precise. Harry looked at the window. The March sky was overcast, gray, with the particular quality of Scottish late winter, stubborn and cold and a long way from being over. He thought about the stone behind the third-floor corridor. He thought about the fragment in him, awakening to the pull of what was in Quirrell's classroom and down the corridor and through the traps. He thought about Dumbledore's careful plan, bait, trap, the thing being caught being larger than the stone. He thought about 500 families. He stood up. "I need to speak to Dumbledore," he said. "Right now. And I need you there." Dumbledore's expression when Harry laid it out was the expression of a man whose calculation had just encountered a variable he hadn't accounted for, and who was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. "You knew about the resonance risk," Harry said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clarification. "I knew the fragment would become active if the source was sufficiently close," Dumbledore said. "I didn't know the timeline had compressed this significantly." He looked at Margit. "Weeks. At most," Margit said. "Possibly less. And the extraction is necessary and is possible and needs to happen before he goes anywhere near Quirrell again." She looked at Dumbledore with the patience of someone dealing with a man who is accustomed to having more time than he currently has. "The question of whether you address what's in Quirrell is separate. The question of whether you let this boy keep carrying a fragment that is now actively seeking to rejoin its source is not a question. It is a medical situation." "I agree," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him. "The stone." "Yes. Whatever you're planning to catch using the stone as bait, Quirrell going after it is your trigger." "Yes. You were going to let it play out." Dumbledore held his gaze. "I was going to be here when it did." "I intended, he can't go after the stone while I'm the blast radius," Harry said. "So either we deal with Quirrell now, before the fragment destabilizes further, or we do the extraction tonight and then deal with Quirrell on a cleaner timeline." He paused. "But we're not waiting for a convenient moment. That option closed." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Margit. "Can the extraction be performed here?" "I need a pollen," Margit said. "I cannot do it alone. The bloodline technique requires 2 practitioners at this magnitude." "A pollen will come tonight," Harry said. "She's already been in contact with you." He looked at Dumbledore. "She told me she was speaking to you last night." "What did she say?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "She said the same thing Margit is saying. That the timeline had moved. That she needed access to Hogwarts." He paused. "I told her I would prepare the ground." "Have you?" "The flue will be open for her from 6 o'clock. Harry nodded. "Then tonight, we deal with the fragment. And then we deal with Quirrell, and whatever's in him, before the week is out." He looked at Dumbledore. "Together. All of us. No more separate plans." Dumbledore considered this. Then he nodded, with the specific quality of a man accepting terms he finds reasonable. "Together," he said. "Apollon came through the flue at 6:30. She came alone, which surprised Harry until she crossed the entrance hall and he read her face, not the controlled public face, not the investigation face, the actual face, the one she wore in the estate kitchen at 4 in the morning with the list and the coffee. She was afraid. Not of what was happening to Harry, or not only that, but afraid in the specific way of a parent who has been managing the fear for 10 years and is now, for the first time, in the same room with it. She crossed to him immediately and put both hands on his face and looked at him. "The readings," she said. "Margit's in the hospital wing. She'll walk you through it. Are you in pain?" "No." "Are you lying?" "No." He held her gaze. "I'm fine. I need this done and then I'm fine." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she dropped her hands and turned to Dumbledore, who was standing to the side with the expression of a man allowing space for something that didn't require him. "Albus," she said. "Apollon." He paused. "Thank you for trusting this building." "I'm trusting Harry's judgment," she said. "He trusts you on this. That's enough for tonight." Dumbledore accepted this. They went to the hospital wing. Margit and Apollon worked for 2 hours. Harry sat in the center of the ward on a conjured stone circle. The bloodline extraction required a physical focal point, a grounded surface. Margit had explained this, had explained all of it in the precise language she used for everything, and Harry had listened and understood and then had sat down and let them work. Ron and Hermione were in the corridor outside, which was Apollon's condition, close enough to reach quickly, far enough not to interfere with the working. Fleur wasn't here. He thought briefly about the fact that she wasn't and felt a small specific missing, the absence of her particular version of presence, and filed it away. Dumbledore stood in the far corner of the ward and did not interfere. The extraction was not painful. That was the first thing he registered. He'd braced for pain and found instead something stranger, a sensation of reaching, of something being carefully disentangled from something else, the way you'd separate threads of 2 different colors that have become woven together. The 500 were very active during it, shifting and moving in that collective way, and what Apollon and Margit were doing was working through them, finding the thread of the fragment, darker than the others, colder, the specific signature of something that had been intended as a tether, and pulling it loose, carefully, with the slowness that precision required. He felt it come free. The moment was simple. No explosion, no surge, no dramatic reversal. Just the sensation of something that had lived in him for 10 years becoming suddenly exterior, held between Apollon's hands in a contained working, a small dark shape like a splinter of obsidian, contained and diminished, already losing cohesion outside the environment it had been anchored in. Dumbledore crossed the room and extended a small crystal vial. Apollon deposited the fragment into it. He sealed it with a charm Harry recognized as something much older than standard containment magic. Silence. Then Margit said, in the tone of a professional delivering an assessment, "Clean extraction. The fragment is fully exterior. Harry's core is intact." She looked at him. "How do you feel?" He checked. Carefully. Mapped the interior landscape the way he'd learned to do over years of Margit's check-ins. The 500 were there, warm and dense and layered in their familiar architecture. His own core sat at the center of them, his by every reading. But the cold thread that had always been there, that he had grown so accustomed to that he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a low-grade sound, was gone. The absence was enormous. Not because the fragment had been significant in size, but because the space it had occupied was now simply open, simply his, simply nothing more than him. "Good," he said. "I feel good." Apollon put her hand on his shoulder and kept it there for a moment longer than professional necessity required. They addressed Quirrell 3 days later. Harry had spent those 3 days being very aware of how different the fragment's absence felt. The 500 were still there, would always be there, until the day Apollon's investigation was complete enough to find a way to restore each one, which was the next phase of the work, years of it still ahead. But they felt different without the cold thread. Warmer. More themselves. As though they had always been slightly compressed against the fragment's presence and were now, quietly, and without drama, expanding into the space it had left. He also spent those 3 days watching Quirrell with the enhanced clarity of someone who had removed the resonance signal from the equation. The fragment was gone. Quirrell still had whatever was in him, the resonance had been between the fragment and its source, and the source was still present. But without the fragment amplifying the call, Harry could read it more cleanly. It wasn't just Voldemort in Quirrell. It was Voldemort through Quirrell, inhabiting, using, directing. A Dark Lord in the wreckage of a body he'd stolen, running on borrowed resources toward the stone because the stone was the fastest path back to a form of his own. Harry told Dumbledore this. Dumbledore already knew most of it. The parts he didn't know, he listened to carefully. On a Thursday evening, Dumbledore called Harry into his office and said, simply, "Tonight." Harry went to find Ron and Hermione. The third-floor corridor was quiet at midnight. Not empty, the traps were active, the magic alive and waiting in the dark behind the locked door. But quiet in the way that set-up things are quiet before they're triggered. Harry, Ron, and Hermione moved through it with the specific ease of people who had been studying its structure for 6 months. Hermione had the logic puzzle solved before they reached it. Ron navigated the chess board with the focused ferocity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this use of a skill. Harry moved through the obstacle course in front of it with the unhurried certainty of someone who had read the architecture of every barrier and found none of them designed for someone with his particular combination of attributes. The final chamber smelled of old magic and damp stone and something else, the Dark Lord resonance, distinctive now that he wasn't carrying a matching signal. It filled the room like smoke. The mirror of Eriste was there. Quirrell was there. He turned when Harry entered, and his expression went through several things very quickly: surprise, because whatever he'd been told about Harry Potter had clearly not included the version currently standing in front of him. Fear, briefly. Then calculation. "You're alone," Quirrell said. "Ron and Hermione are above," Harry said. "Dumbledore is on his way." He looked at the mirror. "The stone isn't in there for you. It never was. That's not how the mirror works." Quirrell's stammer was completely absent. Had been, Harry suspected, for a long time. "The stone is not going to give you what you came for," Harry said. "Whatever he's promised you, whatever he's told you he'll give you in exchange for your body and your loyalty and whatever's left of your actual self, it ends in the same place for you either way." He looked at Quirrell steadily. "There's still a person in there. I can feel it. The resonance has 2 layers, there's him, and there's you underneath him, and they are not the same thing." Quirrell's face did something that was not quite his own. "Touching," said a voice through him that was not Quirrell's voice, cold and without body, the specific sound of something that had been a voice for so long it had forgotten the warmth voices were supposed to have. "You've grown, boy." Harry looked at the back of Quirrell's head. "You lost the fragment," he said. "A few days ago. You felt it go." A pause. Then, "Clever." "Not particularly. Just prepared." He moved slightly to the left, circling. Not toward the mirror. Away from it, giving himself options. "You're going to tell me about the other 3. The ones you haven't collected yet." "I beg your pardon." "The other anchors." The fragment was one of 7. "I've read enough of Margot's texts to understand the architecture." He kept his voice even. "Where are the others?" Quirrell turned with him, keeping Harry in front. The cold voice was very still. "You've been doing your homework." "I've been doing my homework for 10 years, Harry said. "The 500 cores you used to anchor the fragment, where did the other 6 go?" "The other 6 anchors." "You presume there are others." "I know there are others. The soul magic for that kind of anchor requires minimum 5 division points to be stable. 7 for longevity. I know the math." He looked at Quirrell. "Tell me where they are and this ends better for you. For the actual you, not the thing wearing you." Quirrell lunged. Harry sidestepped. The reflexes were not trained, not practiced in any formal sense. He had never had a dueling class, had never been taught to fight by anyone. But the 500 had been providing him with something Margot had described as ambient magical intuition for 10 years, and what that meant in practice was that his magic moved before his mind caught up, reading threats and responding with a speed and precision that had no formal name. He caught Quirrell's wand arm, and the contact did the thing he'd been warned it might do, the thing Dumbledore had not fully explained but had not denied when Harry had asked directly, the thing that had to do with his mother's protection and the specific way it had been woven into his magical signature by an act of love that the Dark Lord's magic had never understood. Quirrell's face contorted. The voice that was not his own made a sound that had no human analog. The 500 moved. Not toward Quirrell. Not outward in any directed way. But Harry felt them respond to the contact, to the Dark Lord's proximity, all 500 of them shifting at once in their dense collective warmth, a response to the thing that had originally stripped them from their owners, a recognition that was not hatred but was very like it, the specific resonance of 500 people's fundamental magical identity confronting the entity responsible for their theft. It was, briefly, devastating. Quirrell fell. Harry stepped back. The room was very hot. He hadn't noticed it becoming hot. The stone floor was warm under his feet and the air smelled of burning and something else, something older, the smell of magic being used at a scale that left marks. He looked at his own hands and they were fine, no burns, no damage, the protection his mother had woven into him doing what it had always done. The voice came again, thinner now, barely coherent, losing the shape of itself. The boy has no idea what he carries. I have an excellent idea, Harry said. 500 stolen lives. An army of the robbed. And you use it to protect people. The voice was almost amused. Almost. Underneath the cold there was something that had once been a person, something wizen and old and reduced by its own choices to a thing that wore bodies and broke minds, and Harry could hear the ghost of that person in the tone, very distantly. Your father would have done the same. My father is dead, Harry said. You did that. Yes, said the voice, without inflection. I did. It was an honest answer, which was more than he'd expected. Then Quirrell collapsed entirely, and the dark shape that rose from him, thin and formless and barely there, the remnant of a soul that had divided itself too many times and was now less than any of its parts, moved for the door and found Dumbledore standing in it. What Dumbledore did next Harry could not fully describe afterward. It was magic of a kind he didn't have the language for yet, ancient and specific, the kind that came from decades of study and the particular quality of a mind that had been preparing for exactly this moment since it had first understood what Voldemort was trying to do. The dark shape was not destroyed, it couldn't be, not completely, not while the other anchors existed somewhere, but it was dispersed, reduced further, scattered. The room went quiet. Quirrell was breathing. Barely. Dumbledore looked at Harry. The others, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. We know about the others. That is the next work. He moved to Quirrell. Are you hurt? No. He paused. The stone. Safe. Dumbledore looked at the mirror. And going somewhere considerably more secure in the morning. He looked back at Harry with the expression he'd worn twice before, the honest one, the one without performance. You fought him directly. I had leverage, Harry said. 500 people's worth. That's not why you won. Harry looked at him. You won because you walked in without fear, Dumbledore said. And that is not leverage. That is character. Harry didn't say anything. He looked at Quirrell on the floor, at the shape of the man who'd been borrowed for a Dark Lord's ambition and had made bad choices and was now, on the stone floor of a trap corridor, paying for them. He thought about complicity. About the people on the wall who had been peripheral actors, who had facilitated without fully knowing, who had looked away because looking away was easier. He thought about the line between Quirrell and those people and whether the line was as clear as it looked from a distance. He didn't have an answer. He filed the question for later. April burned toward May. Sirius Black's review was completed on the 14th of April. Harry was at Hogwarts, in Transfiguration, when Voltaire arrived through the classroom window with a letter that McGonagall allowed only because she had read Apollin's letter to her the previous week and understood why. He read it under the desk. It's done. The Wisengamot voted 39 to 23 for full exoneration. Sirius Black walked out of Azkaban this morning at 8 o'clock. He is currently at St. Mungo's for the standard post-incarceration evaluation. He asked for you. Harry put the letter in his pocket. He finished Transfiguration. He went to dinner. He ate. Then he went to the Ollery and wrote to Sirius Black for the first time in his life. The letter took 4 drafts. Not because he didn't know what to say but because he was discovering that what he wanted to say was more than he'd expected, larger and stranger and more layered than he'd anticipated. He had known about Sirius for 10 years. Had read every piece of documentation about him in the war room, had seen Apollon build his case year by year with the same patience she brought to everything. Had known him as a category, wrongfully imprisoned, godfather, grief-wrecked and revenge-seeking in a dark lane in 1981, before he knew him as a person. The final letter said, "Sirius, Apollon told me you asked for me. I'm at Hogwarts for another 2 months. When I'm home at the end of June, I want to meet you properly. Not the version of meeting that's about what happened. Just meeting. Apollon will have you to the estate if you want. She's been waiting to return something to you for 10 years. She didn't tell me what it is, which means it's something that should stay between you and her. I'm glad you're out. That's the main thing." Harry he sent it with Voltaire, who went without complaint. The response came in 3 days, not a letter, a single card with Apollon's stationary crest and 2 lines of handwriting he didn't recognize, spiky and slightly uneven, the writing of someone whose hands hadn't done this in a decade, the estate, June. "I'll be there. Tell Apollon the wine had better be good." Harry read it and laughed, a real one, full and unreserved, in the Ollery with the birds watching and the evening light coming through the gaps in the stone. The last week of term brought Hermione to him with a look he recognized, the look of someone who has found something important and is assessing how to deliver it. "The other anchors," she said, sitting across from him in the library. She had 3 books open and 2 pages of notes. "I think I know how to find them. Not their locations, but what they are. The method Voldemort would have used for the division points requires specific objects. Significant objects with strong historical magical resonance. I cross-referenced the Dark Artifacts Registry with Hermione." She looked up. "Write it down," he said. "All of it. Everything you found. Then give it to me and I'll send it to Apollon before we leave." He paused. "This is the next phase. She needs to know you're on it." Hermione looked at her notes. Then at him. "This is going to take years." "Yes. Even with Apollon's resources, finding and destroying 7 soul anchors while the soul they're anchoring is actively trying to reconstitute itself, while the political fallout of the Wisengamot hearing is still rippling through the ministry, while you're still at school, yes," he said. "Years. Probably." She was quiet. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I've been working on something for 10 years. I know what the long game feels like." He looked at her. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it with equal honesty. "No," she said, which came out slightly surprised, as though she'd expected her own answer to be different. "No, it doesn't." She looked at her notes. "I thought it would. But it just feels like, there's more work. And the work matters." "That's exactly it," he said. Ron appeared at the end of the aisle with his bag over one shoulder and the expression of someone who had been looking for them for 10 minutes and was not particularly bothered by having found them in the library again. "Dinner," he said. "Also, Neville wants to talk to you." Harry looked up. "About what?" He didn't say. "But he's been trying to get to you all week and you've been," Ron gestured at the books and notes, "busy." Harry stood. Neville was in the common room, waiting with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting long enough to have stopped fidgeting about it. He looked up when Harry sat down across from him, and his expression was doing several things at once: the round face, the steady hands, the eyes that Harry had been watching all year developed the specific quality of someone who had been carrying something too heavy and was finally deciding to set it down. "My parents are on the wall," Neville said. "Not a question." Harry met his eyes. "Yes. I overheard you talking to Hermione. In November. In the common room." He paused. "I wasn't eavesdropping. I heard it. And I've been sitting with it since then." "I know." Harry had known since November. Had watched Neville with the wall in mind, had given him the space to come to it in his own time. "What do you want to know?" Neville looked at his hands. Are the people who did it on the wall too? Yes. Are they facing it? The hearing, the investigation, are they facing what they did to my parents? The direct perpetrators, the ones who performed what was done to them, 3 of them are named in the formal criminal investigation that opened in January. 2 are being prosecuted by the British Ministry as of last month. Harry paused. The 3rd died in 1992. The investigation is ongoing. Neville was quiet for a long moment. The common room fire crackled. Above them, the portraits of Gryffindors past moved in their frames with the slow murmur of things that had been alive long enough to find most things worth a quiet observation. Does it help? Neville said finally. Knowing they're facing it. Does the knowing help? Harry thought about this carefully, because it was the most important question Neville had asked and deserved an honest answer, not a kind one. It doesn't give you back what was taken, he said. Nothing does that. But it changes the shape of it. It means the thing that was done to them happened in a world that eventually looked at it clearly and called it what it was. He paused. I think that matters. Not enough. But it matters. Neville nodded slowly. He sat with this, the way he sat with most things, solidly, without rushing toward resolution. Harry had come to understand over the course of a year, one of the most genuinely sturdy people he had ever encountered. Not unaffected. Not insensitive. But fundamentally difficult to knock down in the ways that counted. Can I come to France? Neville said. This summer. I want to see the wall. Harry looked at him. I'll ask Apollon. He already knew what she would say. June arrived. The school year wound down with the specific energy of a term that had contained too much, the hearing, the fragment, Quirrell, the stone, the Dark Lord's dispersal, the other anchor still somewhere out there in the world waiting to be found. Harry sat his end-of-year exams with the focused attention he brought to everything and did well without drama, because drama about exams had always seemed like energy that could be better applied. On the last evening before the trains, Hermione gave him 17 pages of notes on the anchor theory. He read all 17 pages on the platform and handed them back to her. This is excellent, he said. Keep the original. I'm going to remember it. She looked at him. You're going to remember 17 pages. The methodology, the cross-references, the 3 most likely object types. Yes. The 500 have been giving me an unusual degree of magical intuition for 10 years, he said. Good memory is part of it. He paused. Also I read it twice very carefully. She made a sound that was mostly exasperation and partly, if you were listening for it, something warmer than that. Ron shook his hand on the platform, which turned into a brief fierce hug that neither of them acknowledged afterward, which was exactly how it should have been. The estate received him the way it always did. Jean-Pierre had cooked. Gabrielle had a new diagram. Fleur was home from Beaux Batons, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that communicated she had been counting the days and would not be admitting this. He went to her first. She hugged him with both arms and briefly, completely, and said into his hair, "You handled it. All of it." "We handled it," he said. "Different people. Plural. You know what I mean." "I know." He pulled back. "The anchors. Hermione has a theory on what they are." "Of course she does." But the tone was warm. "Later. Come eat first." He ate. Gabrielle showed him the diagram. It was, as usual, correct in ways that required 3 readings to fully appreciate, this one cross-referencing the post-hearing ministry personnel changes with the names on the wall's peripheral network to identify 3 individuals who had quietly transferred to international postings in the weeks after the vote. He added marginal notes. She added 3 more after him. The war room was different. He noticed it when he went in after dinner, Apollon beside him. The wall was the same, the grid, the string, the green and red and black corners. But 409 had become 436. She had added 27 names in the month since January. He stood and looked at all of them and felt the 500 shift through him in their collective warmth. 219 names from the original reading still unconfirmed, she said, beside him. Fewer than last year. Significantly fewer. She looked at the wall. The formal investigation has opened channels that were closed before. 3 families came to me directly last month, after the Weisengamot hearing. Each of them gave me 2 more names. She paused. It accelerates now. Each name leads to others. The network is no longer protected by institutional silence. He thought about what the dark shape in the corridor had said. 500 stolen lives. An army of the robbed. He thought about the way it had said it, not with contempt exactly, but with the specific tone of something that had never understood what it was creating by doing what it did. Had never understood that the thing it had stolen and compressed into a weapon had spent 10 years becoming something else entirely. Something that moved in the warm part of him that was not fear and not power and not strategy. Something that felt, when he was standing in this room with Apollon beside him and the names on the wall and the whole enormous ongoing weight of the work still to be done, like purpose. Sirius is outside, Apollon said. He looked at her. He arrived an hour before you did, she said. I put him in the garden with wine. I told him to wait. What did you give him to return? She looked at him sideways. The corner of her mouth moved. His name, she said. On its own card. Not on the wall, not where it was. Somewhere else. She pulled open the desk drawer and showed him, a single card, white, with black ink, in her precise hand. Sirius Black. Godfather. 1981 to 1993, wrongfully imprisoned. 1993, free. In the corner, a mark he hadn't seen on the wall before. Not green, not red, not black. Gold. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went outside. Sirius Black was in the garden under the oak tree, sitting in the grass with his wine and his face tilted up toward the evening sky with the specific quality of a man learning to be outside again, the way you learn a language you once knew, with the recognition that comes before the fluency. He looked older than the photographs in the war room, which were from 1981 and showed a different kind of man, laughing, loose, the version of himself that existed before Azkaban. But the eyes were the same. Dark, sharp, and currently looking at Harry across the garden with an expression that was doing several enormous things at once and doing all of them honestly. Harry walked across the garden and sat down in the grass across from him. They looked at each other for a moment. You're taller than I expected, Sirius said. You look like your file photograph, Harry said. Minus 12 years. Sirius laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him, raw and a little unsteady, the laugh of a man who is rediscovering what it feels like. She showed you the file. She showed me everything, Harry said. Since I was 7. Everything. Everything. Sirius was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm, the garden full of June light, the enormous roses at the south wall glowing in the late sun. He looked at the roses. What happened to those? Experiment. 11 years ago. They grew back larger than they should have. Harry paused. I might have been involved. Sirius looked at the roses, then at Harry, then at the roses again with the expression of a man recalibrating his estimates. James would have loved you, he said, and it came out simple and direct, without the weight of performance, just the fact of it. He would have been completely insufferable about how much he loved you. You'd have had to tell him to stop at least 3 times a day. Harry looked at the roses. Tell me about him, he said. So Sirius did. He talked for a long time, while the evening light moved through its changes and the garden settled into early dark, and the wine was finished and more brought by Jean-Pierre who appeared and disappeared with the tact of a man who understood exactly what was happening in his garden. He talked about James Potter in the way that people talk about someone who mattered enormously, not carefully, not with the editing of grief, but freely, with the specific generosity of someone who has held the stories for too long alone and is finally giving them somewhere to live. Harry listened. He felt the 500 settle around him in their warm architecture, and the absence of the fragment was its own presence now, a clean space in the center of things, and the garden was dark and full of the smell of June, and somewhere in the study the wall had 436 names on it and 219 still to find. There was so much left to do. He already knew that. He had known it since he was 7, sitting in the leather chair while Apollon showed him the wall for the first time and said, "I'm showing you because you deserve to know, not because I want to burden you." He had known it in all the mornings since, reading letters, cross-referencing names, sitting in Hogwarts classrooms with the 500 warm in him and the list growing in France. He had known it in the Wisengamot chamber, standing in the stone circle while the assembled institution looked at him. He had known it in the corridor, facing what was left of a Dark Lord, and afterward, and now, sitting in a garden with a man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for 12 years who was telling him about his father. He knew the work was not over. He knew Voldemort's return was coming. He knew there were 6 more anchors somewhere in the world. He knew the 219 names were waiting to be found. He knew all of it, and it settled in him the way the 500 settled in him, not as weight exactly, but as substance, as the dense warm architecture of something that had been built over years and was still being built, every name added to the wall another piece, every family given answers another piece, every truth put into a room where it had to be looked at directly another piece. The work was not a burden he carried. It was the thing he was for. In the study, the wall waited with its 436 names and its empty spaces and its gold-marked card in the desk drawer. Outside, the roses grew taller than they should have in the dark. In Azkaban, an empty cell that had held a good man for 12 years was dark and cold and no longer relevant. Across Europe, 219 families didn't yet know that someone was coming for their truth. Apollon's quill was already moving. The names were still coming. And the boy who had been found in the rubble, who carried 500 stolen flames in the center of himself and had never once been afraid of the weight of them, sat in the dark garden of the only home he had ever known and listened to stories about a father who would have been proud of every single thing.